It's 4 o'clock. I'll just start. I noticed as I was getting some of our speakers set up that it looked like there was a bit of trouble bouncing up and down with the speaker's exit. Did you have any problem getting started? Like, do we need to double check to make sure the space is running well?
I did have the same problem that we had with Ryan's space last Sunday, but hopefully everybody can hear us, and we'll wait and get some feedback from others. If you can hear us, it would be helpful to give us some thumbs ups.
Okay, I'm seeing a few thumbs up. Okay, good. So we'll just get going then. Just didn't want to launch into it if we were having tech problems. If you requested speaker and you didn't get up, just feel free to request again. We'll add everybody who's a regular. Okay, so guys, thanks very much for joining us today. If you haven't been to this space before, what we do here is we cover the news. We use lots of mainstream sources, but we try to accent that heavily by the use of open source information, a lot of it collected from great accounts here on Twitter. In addition to covering the news, we try to present tools and techniques. So whether you're new to looking at open source information or you've been at it a while, hopefully you'll find something interesting and we can all build our skills up together. And then we often will have guests on in order to present the good work that they've been doing. In that way, we hope you can discover some projects that are interesting to you and you can find ways to help out, and we can build greater collaboration in the community. We don't have a speaker today, but we're working on a couple. I think we have one for Thursday, and we have a couple we're talking to for the next couple of weeks. So today will be update focused. I'll start for the first 15 or so minutes with the usual resources, and then we'll launch just into updates. It's been a little bit slower in the last few days. There were always things going on the ground in Ukraine, but maybe not at the same pace. So we may have a little bit more leisurely rate of discussion today. These spaces rely on heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the spaces window where links to individual tweets are posted. So for example, if you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see that's the invitation to today's space. If you were to click through that, you would find behind it in the thread our agenda, which are essentially my speaking notes. The reason I include all those sources is so that essentially you don't have to take for granted what I say. I try to provide sources for just about everything. Also, if a topic interests you, then it gives you a starting point to launch off with further reading. What that allows you to do is to look ahead in the schedule and develop comments and questions. If you have those, when we get to that point in the discussion, please do request the mic and we'll try and bring you up. You can do that by hitting the button that's in the bottom left-hand corner of the Spaces window. And we'd love to get as many people into the conversation as possible. So if you're enjoying the conversation, then please consider retweeting the space, and the button for that is in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. Okay, I will just start working through the material I've started within the nest. At the far right-hand side, once again, that's the invitation to our space today. and the thread behind that has the speaking notes. The second item from the right is the invitation for our next discussion. I hold these talks every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern and every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. So you can set your reminder for the next one now. The third item from the right is a reminder that friends of ours live stream these conversations to YouTube. I'd encourage you to participate here on Twitter because that's how you can join the conversation. But if you've missed an episode and want to catch up, or it's just more convenient because you're driving or doing chores, check out that YouTube channel in the link. Okay, the fourth item from the right is our community calendar, essentially. And so there are some hosts here on Twitter who cover developments in Ukraine or other OSINT-related topics. And so this is to coordinate our spaces so everybody can keep track of them. We also add some outside events. We've just begun September, so there aren't as many events on it as usual, but we'll slowly build that up. If you were to open that link in your browser, it will bring up the calendar. And then individual events will usually have links either to registration pages for upcoming talks or spaces, or usually there are recordings, so you can go back if you missed an event. If you have any events coming up in the next little while that you think the community would be interested in, feel free to DM them to me or to Jacoby, who's in the audience, or to Planet Ben. So that was our friend, formerly Planet Baroque, who occasionally changes her name. Looking at that tweet under calendar and media, there are a couple of podcasts that came out in the last few days. I'll speak to them rather than breaking them out individually. The first of which is a YouTube video that was produced by the BBC. It was called Putin's Influencers. It's about 10 minutes long, and it goes through a profile on some of the well-known Russian military bloggers who we discussed from time to time. Occasionally they become the news all on their own because of controversy. They anger the Kremlin. I think there were rumors some of them may be wanted for arrest because of criticism of Russian military performance. Occasionally they're injured or killed, but they are a factor in the way the Kremlin's prosecuting the war. So I think it's interesting the BBC decided to profile them. The second item is a talk that was hosted by Chatham House. Now it has a bit of a controversial title. It says, "Has Ukraine's counteroffensive failed?" But interestingly, when they tweeted it out, they said, "Hey, this is a controversial title, but believe it or not, our guests are very much of the opinion that Ukraine's counteroffensive is proceeding, apace. So we're not calling it a failure." They might have wanted to choose a different title, but they had some great speakers in there, including Christopher Miller and Ulrich Franke, who do great commentary on the war. There was also a documentary that is going to be released very shortly, if not in the last day or so. It's put out by the Kyiv Independent, and it's called Bullet Holes. And, it's a tragic subject, but it's looking into killings of Ukrainian children by the Russian army during the war. I saw a post from time to time. Ukrainian prosecutors will come out and announce, this is the number of children who we believe have been killed during the course of the war. If I'm not mistaken, I think I saw this week they came out and said, confirmed over 500 now, and that's likely quite an undercount. And then the last item I wanted to highlight in terms of media, it's from a new podcast that I just discovered. The podcast is called Behind the Lines, and it's hosted by a gentleman named Arthur Snell. But they had a fairly high-profile guest on in the form of Dr. Matthew Ford, who is a professor of essentially war studies. And they had a conversation about the impacts, or I guess I should say the successes of Ukraine's information warfare techniques. And I think we can all agree that Ukraine has done a terrific job in the information warfare space. So I'm sure that will be a great talk. Moving along in the nest, the item, it's right in the middle. and I guess the third or the fourth in from the left now. It's the tweet titled "Resources," and again, I'll speak to these rather than break them out. But this first item, actually, you know what? I will break these out. Hold on. Anyway, the first item is a thread that was put together by an account who's new to me. But every so often, people will try to take a fairly wide-ranging shot at saying, hey, here are some great accounts to follow in connection with the war in Ukraine. Here are my thoughts on accounts. And so this account, Jeremy Levitt, did that. I briefly DM'd with him, and I get the understanding that Jeremy has done war studies and kind of works in this field. And so he is coming from, his personal but informed opinion. And I bring it up because he highlights several great accounts to follow. So you guys might want to have a look at that list. That should be the first item in the nest. The second item will be linked to Brady Afric's map, which we have all seen. I've highlighted it plenty of times. In this case, I'll admit I'm not sure if it's a brand new edition, but I believe it is, whereby on his map now, when you zoom in to individual points along the fortification line, in many cases, if you click on them, they'll open up a link to an image. So you can actually see the satellite imagery of that particular fortification point, because a dot on a map doesn't necessarily give you insight into terrain or, the orientation of the fortification or, how significantly it looks to be developed. But now you can see them, directly in imagery, which I thought was a really cool addition. I'll have to follow up with some of our mapper friends who rely on using some of Brady's map layers to know whether this feature, where it allows, the click through to the imagery, is something that's embedded in the map layer and therefore exportable. I presume there's a huge database that backs it, so I don't know how easily that's transferable, but it would be interesting to find out whether you can just take that whole set of his links to the images and keep them intact if you import them into your own maps. The third item, this is kind of a minor one, but there's a ton of cyber OSINT that goes on. It's a huge field. We don't touch on it a lot. It's big because it has lots of commercial implications, and it's been under development for a decade or more. Because we tend to focus more on open source information that relates to what's happening on the ground and sort of at the diplomatic level. But I do like to touch on these cyber items. And this was one that was general enough I thought was interesting. It's the tweet from Sophia Santos, who does great work tracking OSINT matters. And she noted there's now a change in the file types that are indexable by Google, so that comma-separated values, which is a file type used for lots of very simple sort of flat database structures, will now begin to be indexed by Google. And so if you're into cyber things, it could be that Google will suddenly uncover or kind of reveal a whole bunch of basic databases in websites that previously, they were always there, but they previously weren't something that you could search using Google's tools. And now you will be able to do that. So you might be able to go out and do some searching and discover some new things. Okay, I'll run through a couple of examples for maybe 5 minutes. So I'm now on the fifth tweet from the left, titled Examples. And I suppose I'll break some of these out individually, so if you bear with me. Some of these are, they're like minor things, but they often represent some interesting techniques, or just, somebody has seen a question and they've said, hey, I can go out and solve that. And so sometimes I highlight these for technique basis. Sometimes I do them, sort of as inspiration to say, hey, this is something that lots of people could do. You don't necessarily have to have expertise. And it might inspire you to say, oh, I have some data I could pour through and do something similar. So the first of these is a database that it will appear in just a moment. It's just a little one. It's in a tweet from the account Offbeat Research. And it's a little database that was put together by a friend of ours, Commander Nizar, who had a look at rare and unusual sources of munitions that are being used by the armed forces in Ukraine. And with a lot of these, they include Jordan, Sudan, Iran, Pakistan, North Korea. And in a lot of these cases, it was a very circuitous path that led to these weapons winding up in Ukrainian hands. I should follow up with Commander Nizar to see if he's going to do a similar look at unusual munitions in Russian hands. But as the war has gone on, I know it's hard for me to keep track of these, and I'm paying very close attention. So I always appreciate it when somebody takes a subject like this and draws it together so that you have it all in one place and you can refer to it in the future. The second item in the nest is a little video that actually shows the before and after of the impact of the Russian lunar probe. The reason I've included this one is thinking about the degree of OSINT. Do you know what I mean? As in, we had heard the report that the Russian lander crashed. The Russians admitted it. Those who were tracking, radio transmissions from it, saw, it ceased transmission, but then kind of running these items down right to the end where you now get a visual confirmation of the crash site. I just appreciate that there are people out there who are, following up and getting all these last little details. The third item back is a tweet from All Eyes on Wagner. And what they have done is, because of their interest in Wagner's involvement in Africa, there were rumors that there is a Russian intelligence, I believe he's a general or senior officer in the Russian intelligence, and his name is Averyanov. And there were rumors that he is the person who has been put in charge of leading the Kremlin's efforts to take over some of the areas of operation in Africa that Wagner had been working in. And as a result, because of that sort of contest in Africa between Wagner and the Kremlin, there are rumors he may be a leading candidate for being involved in the crash of Prigozhin's airplane, but that's speculation. Averyanov, was cited attending the Russia-Africa conference about 3 to 4 weeks ago. The reason I like this tweet is that All Eyes on Wagner went back and actually looked at video and photographs from a whole bunch of individual meetings, including Mali, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Burkina Faso, and poured over them to identify that this individual actually attended all of the meetings. And so it's sort of, it's building up that case that he likely is playing that role in running the Kremlin's operations in Africa that he's suspected of. The fourth item back is a tweet from a friend of ours, I have Stolas. And this one I included essentially for motivation reasons. You'll see if you click through it, it's a thread that he put together in response to one of the breaking news channels, I believe, what is it, Clash Report, or let me see here, no, Flash News, which sometimes these channels will oversimplify things. Sometimes they'll do it in a way that sensationalizes an issue. So this Flash News put out a tweet about a Ukrainian Ministry of Defense order that changes some of the categories of medical eligibility, and essentially said, these changes are controversial, and it looks like Ukraine is pushing people with medical conditions into greater military roles, and perhaps this creates risk. And we had a discussion in the background. He said, boy, it's kind of frustrating. I don't think this really reflects the intention of the change. So I went out and I found the order and I passed it to him, and I said, hey, well, why don't you write up a reply thread where you actually go through the nature of the change, and you can compare it to, are these medical policies similar to, say, Western countries, like the US policies? And so he has started working on that. And as he works through the document, he's adding additional details. And I highlight this because this is the sort of thing that anybody can do. If you see an argument or a characterization that you think is wrong, take a few minutes, go and find the original source material and write a response. And I think it's only by that way that we can counter, distorted interpretations of the news. Last item in this block, fifth item in the nest, from the account Rollo. I thought this was pretty cool that Rollo is tracking essentially battle losses, battle damage at the level of city infrastructure, city property. So here he's looking at the town of Berestov, and you'll see if you scroll down, he's quote tweeted himself where he's actually sat and looked at the imagery and identified, to his standard, the level of destruction of buildings in this town. And I suspect it's probably something he's, undertaking for a variety of villages. And in this case, it also goes nicely with the idea of available imagery, because he notes that Google Earth, right, will update its imagery in a given spot from time to time. And he said Berestov was just updated in Google Imagery, and that allowed him to get a much more accurate count of the damage in the town there. So I like highlighting accounts that are doing sort of interesting analysis like this. I have one more block of good examples, and then we can get into updates on the offensive. I'll just put this material up in a moment. So the first of these, which will hopefully appear in just a second, is from an account called Dusk Shift. And we, in the last few weeks, have increasingly been interacting with some satellite imagery providers, particularly the company Umbra, that's using synthetic aperture radar results. And some of this, this is sort of mixed in terms of these stories being about the drone attack on the Peskov airbase the other day, but it's not necessarily about the battle damage so much as it is about the technique to evaluate it, which can be relevant to us going forward. Sorry, in the background, my interface is slowing down just a little bit, but we'll get all the material up in just a moment. If you bear with me a moment, I'm just going to quickly reset. I'll be back, and then hopefully everything will run a little more smoothly.
While he does that, I will ask Nukes a quick question. The images that Dusk Shift put up, how do they improve? Like, how are they different from the original Umbra images? And then how do they improve what you can tell from what we're looking at?
Well, it looks to me like the main thing was that they took the imagery and either removed the oblique correction. So a lot of times they'll take an image that's shot from the side, from an angle, and then make it look like a flat map with an algorithm. So you can remove that and you can get more of a 3D view out of it. Or with SAR, you actually do get the elevation and the depth. So it's possible that they did a 3D model of the terrain with that and overlaid that on there. You do get a lot more of a you just get a little more three-dimensional detail out of the image that way. I mean, there's really nothing more than that you gain.
Yeah, and so the image that we're referring to is now the first item in the nest from Dusk Shift. And you can see in their tweet that they had said they had reoriented the imagery and they had applied a topographic layer to assist journalists and analysts. And so as between those options Nukes was just referring to, I do think they may have actually applied a sort of a 3D layer effect in order to try to wrap the imagery over that layer to give it the appearance of additional depth, which might make it easier to interpret. So I thought that was a cool development. And there's, again, we've talked about them as they've come out, but these SAR imagery from Umbra and related companies, they're now working on everything from movement tracking or change tracking in imagery. They're trying to do 3D like recreation of terrain, where they don't already have an existing terrain model, but trying to develop terrain models directly from the imagery. So there's a lot of cool things that are being done right at the moment. And some of these have drawn the attention, like I believe it was Umbra or one of the companies working with Umbra that recently got I think it was $120 million contract from the U.S. Air Force to work on change detection in their SAR imagery. So clearly there's lots of, serious interest in these tools now as well. The next interesting example, also coming from Peskov Air Base, but a little bit different. Second item back. It's a tweet from an account. It goes by the name Lars. They're new to me, but they did an interesting analysis. And so they paid super close attention to the video that came out of the attack on the airbase. And what they did was they looked at the way that the taxiways and aircraft pads, they're made up of individual concrete blocks. And this account actually counted the blocks because it's not just a lane, it has some contoured shape to it, which may correspond with the terrain at the airbase itself. And he found that it's not identical in every taxiway. So in that way, you can uniquely identify some of them because of the layout of the concrete blocks. And by doing that, this account noticed that in the video where it showed several apparent munitions drops on these cargo planes, there was one where the munition appeared to explode beside the plane rather than directly on top of it. So if you've seen the video, you'll remember that one. In looking at that video, Lars noted the layout of the concrete blocks, and from the subsequent battle damage imagery, where there were 2 destroyed aircraft and 2 that were clearly damaged, he looked at the layout of the taxiway tiles and said, oh, this one in the video where a munition clearly explodes beside it doesn't have the same taxiway tile layout as any of the known damaged aircraft. Therefore, there's probably a 5th damaged aircraft, which is great inference. I'll admit it didn't occur to me to count the tiles and try and make sure it all matched up. So, credit to whoever this account is. And it now leads to a better understanding of the scope of the attack and degree of damage. Exit, go ahead.
I think the coolest part about this entire thread is that it very specifically details out every single step of the work. So if you're really new to any of this stuff and you want to see step by step how he went through it, this is the perfect thread to kind of study exactly what he was looking for, why he was looking for these things, what he found and what that led him to next, step by step, each one of the things that he did here. And it's really cool to read through. I really enjoyed it.
Nukes, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out on that thread, it's pretty awesome, but I think it was Evergreen Intel that noted it the first time and then put it kind of out for a public review. So should put some credit there as well. I may be mistaken, but I think that's how that went.
You are definitely correct on that. I saw that, and I think Mr. Bond might be coming back. So I will take a quick minute to do some housekeeping. If you are new to Spaces, then up above our heads, you will see all the things that we talk about in here. there, it's called the Nest, and that's where we put all the resources. Mr. Bond mentioned that. And then if you want to find those resources later, you can hit the little button that's down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and that'll take you to the space tweet. You can tweet that out and ask people to come in here and join us, but you also will find all of the things from the Nest shared to the space tweet there, so you can bookmark that if you're looking for resources later in the week.
Thanks for that. My unmute button locked up for a second there, but I'm back. To continue the last couple of examples, if you have a look, these go more or less together. If you have a look at the third and fourth items back, that third item, this is actually a response in the middle of a thread. There's an account that D. Mojavensis is replying to. Mojavensis does a bunch of OSINT work. He's very detailed. The thread he's replying to, it came out asserting that in that same Peskov drone raid, that there may be 5 additional aircraft that were damaged that were not identified. And I wanted to highlight it because I don't think that analysis is right. As in, what he's pointing to is potential evidence of 5 more damaged aircraft doesn't appear to be evidence of that. And what looks like has happened is, if you look at the fourth item back, it's from a friend of ours, MT Anderson. And he was, again, using the Peskov raid in this thread as an example to highlight the technology, the SAR, synthetic aperture radar imagery tech. And in it, he says, here's the change identification between the two different images, so you can see what's moved. And if something has moved, it may be because it was affected during the drone raid. And he drew little boxes around a couple of highlights that were up in the upper right corner of the image. But when he identified them, he just noted them as change. And then if you read in the replies to the thread, they talk about how it's likely that was about difference in the position of the satellite itself relative to the surface material, like the tiling, and that the change there is more about angle of reflection than it is a change to the aircraft itself. At least that's their interpretation. But interestingly, that account in the third tweet found MT Anderson's analysis, just saw he drew boxes around it, that there was a change there, and then went out and said, it looks like 5 more planes have been damaged. And I'm highlighting this as the sort of steps that people take where they don't understand the tech. They don't actually read the thread, because in the thread, in the replies, it explains what the interpretation is for what's happening. And maybe either because they want to be enthusiastic in promoting good news for Ukraine, or they just want to be first to get it out there, they say 5 more planes are damaged, when it doesn't appear that's what the evidence shows. So I just wanted to highlight that one as an example of where things can go awry, and the fact that the account that misinterpreted it took the imagery from MT Anderson, didn't credit him, appeared to intentionally crop the image so that his interpretation text and name were not on it, which in a lot of contexts would be called stealing. So, not cool. Okay, last item, just about, occasionally I like to highlight a philosophy of OSINT idea. Fifth item back in the nest, tweet from The Lookout, who, by the way, great naval analysis account, who consistently had gone by The Lookout and just today announced, oh, hey, I'm going to use my real name going forward. Because, there's a debate. Some people need to use anonymous names. I totally get that. But some people are slowly making the decision about, I prefer to be identified. So you can evaluate me, take me at my word. That's the approach I've taken. It's interesting to see others, making that decision. Anyway, that tweet by The Lookout just highlighted, hey guys, when you're looking at maps of the front, you need to understand the way these maps are composed. So, for example, if you look at the Project OWL, the UA control map, they include units on their map, but they're pretty clear about when we indicate a unit's presence, it may be part of the unit, it may not be the whole unit. We also will give you references to where we drew information from to decide to place a unit at that location, including the date when they were spotted. So they're very careful about what it represents. But I think that a lot of people look at those maps and they think, oh, there aren't very many Russian units on this area. So on Thursday, for example, we were discussing potential options for the Ukrainians to push east through Verbov or focus more to the south. And we were looking at some people who had drawn arrows on the map saying it looks like Russian units here are very thin, so they can just push through. The lookout is highlighting, look, those maps are not comprehensive. They're careful about what their unit locations represent, but a lot of people are not reading those and understanding what they mean. And they're thinking, oh, if there is no units there on the map, then there are none there in real life, when it could just be a lack of information. So you have to understand, there's a difference between evidence of absence and absence of evidence. Those are two different things. But that's enough preaching for me on that topic. And so I'll move into some updates on the offensive. If you bear with me, a reminder that when we discuss these things, we're usually talking about them at a fairly high level. Some of the items we discuss are confirmed, some are slightly speculative. I'll try and identify which is which. And that there are lots of accounts who focus almost entirely on developing maps of changes along the front line. And I would encourage you to look to them. We're not aiming to track all the changes. We're just highlighting the general themes. My goal is to try to find things that may indicate what's likely to happen in the next week or two is sort of the threshold that I'm looking for. And so to that end, I like to include a tweet that has a variety of maps. And so that's now the first item up in the nest. The reason I do that is because different maps, they have different sources on the ground. They may make different calls about what pieces of data mean. Some of them include units, some don't, some show changes, some don't. So I would encourage you to check out several of them. I've used the usual set. There are more that are good. This is just what I can really fit in one tweet and I think are among the best. So the Institute for the Study of War, Andrew Perpetua, DEFMON, Project OWL, Poulet Volant, Deep State, Geoconfirmed. And I've included a weather update from our friend, David Helms, who's been very consistent about putting those out each day. Which is important context. And a reminder that if you want to follow the changes in detail, Andrew Perpetua does a live stream twice a week where he will screen share his map and he'll walk through the changes and speak to them. And he does that on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern and on Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern time, a little bit earlier to try and be available for European friends. So check out his live streams on YouTube if you want a detailed walkthrough. Okay, so the way I try to organize these updates is essentially areas along the front. And I'm pretty well going to work from the west through over to the east. I don't have too many updates on the crossings around the Dnipro. We had talked about how there are several locations where there are raids. Some of those raids have turned into an ongoing presence. I hadn't heard any updates on significant changes here in the last few days. And so instead, what I'm going to speak to first is the debate or just the overview, which is on Thursday, we were talking about, have the Ukrainians broken through that second set of defensive lines near Verbov? And in this case, the tweet is from Medusa, and they're referring to it as the first main defensive line. And a Ukrainian general named Alexander Tarnavsky was interviewed, and he said that Ukrainian forces have broken through that first major line near Verbov. And, we're making progress. On Thursday, we were debating whether it was a breach or just, a probing bypass of it, where a breach would mean that the obstacles were cleared and that, forces can essentially flow through the breach more or less unimpeded. It didn't appear to be at that time. And the General Tarnavsky appears to be suggesting that they have broken through. even if he's not using the term breach. However, the third item back in the nest, following those comments, the BBC actually went out to speak to elements of some Ukrainian units near the front to ask them. And the response there was that no one has yet managed to go beyond the first line. And so it looks like there's a bit of debate where the general is on the record saying they've broken through the line, and units on the front are saying, well, we haven't actually passed through it yet. And so I would suggest that the situation remains pretty close to what it was on Thursday, where the line is permeable and the Ukrainians are capable of raiding through it and, performing recon and so on, but that it's not clear they've moved the bulk of their forces, in significant numbers across the line. The fourth item back. So these are the opinions of watchers of the front line. And so I've cited Defmon here, and he, as of 2 days ago, was essentially saying that he assumes that without actual visual evidence that the Russians are holding their defensive line west of Verbov, and therefore the Ukrainians have not actually pushed into this town yet. We had showed on Thursday some FIRMS data that appeared to show shelling in Verbov moving from the western side over to the eastern side. And, given the passage of time, it looks like that was coincidental in terms of the area that was being focused on in shelling and resulting fires, not that Ukraine was actually passing through Verbov. So it looks like fighting there is ongoing. The fifth item back is, so if Verbov is sort of the eastern thrust that you see on the map, the salient, the one that is pressing to the south is approaching the town whose name is very difficult to pronounce, and I'm going to attempt it as Novoprokopivka. And the update here it's the tweet by Null Reports. And again, this is one that is unconfirmed, but I found interesting. On Thursday, we were talking about the impact of topography and whether that would influence whether Ukrainian forces would push to the east or to the south. This is suggesting there's a little ridge that's highlighted in the image from Null Reports, and it's toward a tiny little village named Pushenichne. And so rumor is from the Russians that the Ukrainians are trying to take this ridge, which would set them up with a little bit of elevation as they may attempt to push into Novoprokopivka. Okay, so it just looks like, once again, Ukrainian successes in that area, pushing slowly to the east and slowly to the south, but they appear to be, proceeding carefully, taking terrain into account. Okay, let me get the next set of materials up. And so this next set of materials will start with moving along the line toward the east a little bit. And the first item is, again, unconfirmed. This is more rumor. It will be, when it populates up in the moment, it's a tweet from Null Reports. And it is some concern that the Russians are expressing about their weaknesses with ongoing pressure that they're receiving from the Ukrainians around the city of Vuhledar, which is a little bit further to the east, where there has been contact. But the Ukrainians haven't advanced very much. It didn't appear to be part of the primary push of the salient. But when I saw it, I thought, oh, that's interesting that the Russians are feeling the weight of the pressure even in an area that doesn't appear to be a focus. So that should appear up in the nest in a moment. What should be the second item in the nest is another tweet from Defmon, and this is moving a little bit further along the line, and this is the So all of those things we've discussed before were around the salient pushing down from Orkiv down toward Robotin. And in this case, we're moving over to the salient that originated out of Velika Novosilka. And so in that second item in the nest, Defmon is saying, hey, there was a rumor that there was a bit more of a push along the salient into a town called Zavidna Bazania. And he's saying, no, I think this was a mistake, and that there was a Twitter account from a tabloid writer who misunderstood some chatter online or misgeolocated it, but there hasn't actually been much of a development on this front. So I just thought I would note that, as that one probably went around as a bit of a mistake. Moving a little further east, up toward the Luhansk, Kharkiv oblasts, the third item back in the nest talks about, it links to an article that Michael Kaufman highlighted, written by the Kiev Independent, that profiles a brigade that's defending in the Kharkiv Oblast, and about the difficulties they're facing as the Russians push in that region and the losses that they're sustaining. And so even though I thought I'd bring this to your attention, because even though the Ukrainians continue to resist the Russian push in that Luhansk, Kharkiv area, it continues to come at a cost. And in that debate about, the Russians are attempting this in an effort to draw Ukrainian forces away from the push into Zaporizhia. The Ukrainians have deployed what they think they need to defend the area, but it still comes at a cost, essentially. The fourth item down links to one of the daily updates from militaryland.net. They have been doing daily updates throughout the war. When I mentioned there are additional maps that are decent or well done, they have one of those. And in particular, in this update, they note apparent small gains that the Russians made around the city of Marinka. And that kind of goes along with the profile done by the Kiev Independent. So the Russian pressure there continues with only small gains. And so the Ukrainians are defending quite stoutly. A couple of sort of independent, sorry, just a moment. Sure. A couple of updates on just events that are interesting, not directly connected with the offensive, I'll get into, and then a few that highlight some potentially different tactics that the Russians are using. So with the related updates, the fifth item back in the nest is a tweet from the Belarusian Hagen Project. And this I could have put this in the diplomacy section, but I thought I'd include it here. There was a claim by the Belarusians that a Polish helicopter had flown fairly deep into Belarusian airspace, I think 1.5 kilometers, before then flying back across the border. And there was video footage that showed a helicopter, and it was geolocated to the border region, and it did appear to show a helicopter crossing in the border area from Belarus into Poland. Interestingly, the Hagen Project looked into this, and what they said is it appears potentially to be a model of helicopter that both Belarus and Poland operate. And while it definitely shows it flying back into Poland, it's unclear who operates this particular helicopter and whether it could possibly, could it have been a Polish helicopter that crossed? Possibly, on this data. Could it have been a Belarusian helicopter that crossed the border into Poland? They're saying it could be. That doesn't appear to be excluded either, which is an interesting interpretation. I don't think, somebody correct me, I don't know if the Poles have come out and denied it. I think maybe I did see one headline that's saying they did deny it. Given that about 2 weeks ago, there was a clear incident where 2 different Belarusian helicopters crossed the border. Apparently they got lost. And we covered it at the time. it wouldn't seem outrageous that this was a repeat of that. But it just, there's not enough evidence from the accounts I've seen that look at it carefully to say specifically what happened. So it's more of one of those to keep an eye on. Okay. Last little item in this block. I do like quantitative updates. Often I'll highlight the Nalcio puts together a summary of losses in the counteroffensive. Nalcio's on vacation for 2 weeks. He's one of those who works with Oryx's losses project. But I did find this interesting tweet. It's the 6th back from Robert Tulp. And Robert does a variety of pieces of analysis. In this case, what he's doing is month by month tracking, according to Oryx's losses database, the models of tank that are lost. And you can try to infer from that if certain models that were widely used at the beginning are being defeated in large numbers, they make up less of the proportion of tanks on the battlefield, and therefore are likely to make up less of the losses, as time goes forward. In that way, you can then look at the tanks whose proportion of losses increased to infer that they may be more widely used on the battlefield because they're being drawn from storage or they're being pushed forward to units where the fighting is the heaviest. And so you can do some interesting analysis with it that way. It seems like Robert appears to have stacked the tank models in this graph according to a degree of modernization, with the most modern at the top. And it does appear that the early models of the T-72, which represented most of the losses initially, have notably decreased in proportion of losses, and that the T-80s, which are the slightly more modern variant, have increased notably in loss proportion, whereas most of the other units have stayed fairly static. So it seems like if we can infer a transition, it would largely be from early model T-72s to T-80s. And then that's the sort of work that is done carefully over a long time that can yield some interesting results. Okay, the next sets of materials I wanted to speak to go to potential changes in Russian tactics, and then a little bit talking about Ukraine having turned its mind to preparations for the winter. And I know that it's only the beginning of September, and for those of you who live in northern climates, you probably don't want to start thinking about winter yet. But the Ukrainians are, and it's probably for the best. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, the first item that should be up there in just a second is a follow-up on our discussion about the drone attack on the Peskov Air Base, which we've already discussed a little bit. Just making sure I get to the front of the nest. And so it should pop up in just a moment. There we go. It's the tweet from Howard Altman. While we were having the discussion on Thursday night and info on the raid was still fairly fresh, I think it may have been Colby who said, hey, it just broke the news that the head of Ukrainian intelligence, Budanov, has come out and said that these drones were actually launched from inside Russia. And so this, we had heard it on Thursday, but here's the link to the reporting on that. In the Thursday materials, I had included a claim by the one of the Russian opposition units that had been conducting cross-border raids, who had come out and said that they were involved in the launching of drones for attack on one of the other targets on that same night. And so I had used that as a data point to infer it was possible that the Peskov attack had also originated in Russia. And here we have Budanov claiming that that was the case. So we're getting a little bit more insight into how these operations run. The second item that goes to possible changes in Russian tactics, it's a tweet from our friend Sam Bendet. And this was about drone tactics. Generally, what caught my attention was the claim in here, again, coming from a Russian source, but the claim in here that the Russians may now be lacing fields, pastures, where they've laid out minefields with flammable substances. Then if the Ukrainians start to work trying to clear those mines, they'll wait for a little bit of progress to be made till the Ukrainians are deep into the fields, and then they will drop a grenade in order to ignite fire in the whole field. Then they have to deal with both the wildfire and the fact that there are explosive laces through the field. And so this is interesting just in terms of an attempt. I don't know how consistently effective it is, but it also caught my attention because from a different perspective, when we were chatting with Ryan Hendrickson last week as our guest, Ryan runs a demining program or a corporation that engages in humanitarian demining in Ukraine. We had a bit of a discussion there about the use of fire by deminers in order to have the fire detonate some of the smaller mines that are harder to deal with. And he was talking about, but that also comes with a danger where if you lose control of the fire that you've set, then suddenly you have to deal with the fire and the mines. And so it's interesting to me that Sam has uncovered this claim that the Russians have sort of come to the same conclusion that mixing the minefields and fire is a particular risk. Go ahead, Exit.
Well, and this seems like a particularly good time to point out that the weather is starting to change and things are starting to dry out, and the fire risk is much higher now just generally. So any fire that starts is going to spread and probably spread quite quickly. So I would be interested to hear from anybody who has experience about whether or not this is something we've seen in other conflicts. I've certainly never heard of it before, but that literally means nothing because I haven't studied as much of that as some of you have. But it just the perspective of this causing much bigger fires across a larger area is much higher at this time of the year.
So the timing and weather conditions are a great point. I'll admit that I heard about this tactic. It intrigued me, but then I started to think about the dynamics of it in that, how big an area are they lacing with flammable material in that, if they ignite a huge area and they're targeting a demining team, is that overkill? Would the effect of the fire in destroying their own mines that they've laid outweigh the risk to the team? It's not clear to me that it's a particularly logical technique. It just struck me as it's new. I thought I'd highlight it to you. Okay, the last of the apparently new Russian techniques is the third item in the nest. It's the tweet from Status 6. And this was a report. Again, it's Russian sourced, so we can't take it for granted. But the claim is that Russians are starting to use their Mi-28 attack helicopters in an effort to interdict Ukrainian drones near the front lines, which is interesting. And what that meant, there were some accounts that reacted to this claim saying, well, if the Russians are using that technique, does that create opportunities for the Ukrainians to attempt ambushes, whether by putting up, target or decoy drones to try to draw Russian helicopters back closer to the lines where Ukrainian air defense or man pads or related may be waiting. So that sort of the idea of there being an evolution in cat and mouse, that the Russians feel the Ukrainian drones are enough of a threat that they need to risk their attack helicopters in engaging them. All of that I thought was interesting, but I have no idea how the play and counterplay will ultimately work out. A few items I want to get into discussing preparations for winter. And these are a bit of a grab bag, but the fourth item back, it's a tweet from Mick Ryan, who's the retired Australian general, who often will write, sort of broad summaries. And in this case, he's not talking about specific preparations for the Ukrainian military, so much as what are some of the things that may happen in the coming months. That's his definition of winter, essentially. And so a lot of his conversation is essentially about the Ukrainians will want to keep up some momentum. They'll want to continue deep strikes. They'll want to prevent the Russians from consolidating men and material. They also need to work on the diplomatic front to fend off potential political pressure to start engaging Russia in talks. He talks about how essentially Russia has, opposing objectives, which is potentially to consider engaging in an offensive beginning in midwinter. Mick Ryan refers to potentially January, or maybe building up in the idea of an offensive in the spring, as happened this year. And that while engaging that buildup, they'll have to try and do it as covertly as possible, because potentially more Ukrainian focus will shift to long-range fires, deep strikes, to try to find those concentrations. If movement along the front line starts to slow a little bit, that will be the one area they'll really focus on. So anyway, Mick Ryan's analysis is there for you. The fifth item back was a discussion from the Kiev Independent, where they talked about how Ukraine is preparing for possible attacks against energy infrastructure. And so this was Yuri Ignat, who is the Air Force spokesperson, and he talked about the distribution of air defense systems and how their expectation is that with winter coming, Russia may focus on infrastructure in an effort to break down Ukrainian morale, similarly to what they did last year. So they said in anticipating that, they're trying to position air defenses so that they can better defend their infrastructure this year. So I'm optimistic that the Ukrainians are on top of it, and they may have a little bit smoother time this year than they did last. Go ahead, X.
I would just say this points to a general lack of air defense overall, though, because we're talking about, for instance, we haven't got to it, but in the Black Sea, Putin is currently going to meet with Erdogan tomorrow to talk about possibly a new Black Sea grain initiative. The only reason that anybody actually needs that is because there's just not enough air defense to protect all of Ukraine's ports. And so Russia keeps being able to strike the ports, which means that shippers aren't necessarily going to use the corridor that Ukraine has set up. And so taking even more of that air defense away from the port areas to protect infrastructure, which you're going to need to protect more over the winter if Russia does the same thing as they did last year, just kind of points to the fact that they desperately need more. We're not seeing a lot of allies and people in Western countries committing more air defense in general, and it's concerning because I just don't know, like they just cannot cover all the assets that they have.
Well, they're definitely short of air defense. We're not hearing commitments of new systems. Obviously, I would like to hear those commitments. It does strike me that some systems that were ordered on a longer timeline are still slowly being delivered, including from Germany and potentially the United States, under the USAI. We also, on Thursday, it was right at the end of our conversation, and we were hurrying a little bit, but at that time we talked about some contracts and some orders for like the AIM-120, which is a missile that can be used in air defense. We also heard about the AIM-9, which could be used, in aircraft, air-to-air. So it does seem like there is still a bit of a stream, but I agree with you that we'd love to hear more announcements. And we've gotten Colby's attention. So Colby, go ahead.
Thanks. The unfortunate reality is that air defense is the most expensive asset that's being provided to Ukraine, and it's also the asset that has the longest lead time. It's not something that can be done quickly to build from scratch, new complete air defense batteries of any sort of modern type. The radars in particular, these are very complicated, sophisticated pieces of equipment that you can't just brush off the assembly line. So a very significant quantity has been pledged for Ukraine, but it does take time, right? They're going to, eventually Ukraine is going to be the largest NASAMS operator in the world with somewhere between 14 and 16 batteries. But right now they only have probably 3, with the 4th that should be coming sometime this fall from the United States, assuming a sort of a 4-month delivery timeline, which the Pentagon said that they were trying to expedite, but I'm not sure how much they can actually do to make Raytheon build things any faster. So, it's coming, but yeah, it's going to take time, which is why we have to be talking about not just giving Ukrainians air defense to shoot down incoming Russian aircraft and missiles, but also enabling them to strike back against Russia's assets that are actually launching these attacks in the first place, because there's still this very significant imbalance in long-range fires capability.
Yep, that's great additional context. Exit, go ahead.
Colby, in your tracking, do you, and I apologize, you probably do, and I just haven't seen it, but do you have a tweet you could point to of like what's been committed versus what we know is in country already?
I don't on air defense specifically, not exactly. I wrote a short thread last year about NASAMS specifically and what the procurement timeline would look like. I wrote a few sort of follow-up tweets about that as well earlier this year. That's the next project that I've got bouncing around my head, trying to more accurately account for what's actually been delivered versus what's just pledged. And I was lamenting this in another space last night, that the U.S. Department of Defense has a list of all of the equipment that's been committed by the United States, but the manner in which that list is presented is deeply misleading, to say the least. And I would say it's actually quite irresponsible for them to publish it the way they are, because it doesn't adequately inform the public about what's actually been given, because they're just listing both everything that's been actually delivered by a drawdown with everything that they've been committed through USAI, which is a long lead time process. So it doesn't help people understand what actually has been given to Ukraine. So people just see on that list all these NASAMS systems, but as I just said, very few of the total pledged number have actually been delivered. So it'd be very easy for them to change the way that they're presenting that information. But in the absence of that, I'm going to see if I can try and go through the numbers and check their accounting as well to make sure that they're doing it properly, which they weren't. So that's a next project possibly.
And Colby has lots of projects on the go. We got an update on his ATACMS thread, which I heard was at something like 700 individual tweets in the thread. So we'll look forward to that arriving, and then we'll dedicate a day-long space to running through it. Colby, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, not quite 700, but I'll just add that obviously there's Oryx and others who maintain their own lists of what they assess has actually been delivered, and not just from the United States, but all countries. And those are great resources. There are some shortcomings, again, just specifically talking about the U.S., because things that are being pledged through USAI, we're not usually getting sort of formal announcements when they finally arrive in theater for operational security reasons. So it's definitely not 100% comprehensive, because the information may not be there. But I think that's it's a reasonable place to start. Compare Oryx to compare DEA and UA for German stuff. They've got a running tally about what's actually come out of Germany. Jeff from Belgium is another good account that pays close attention to military aid. So those are all good sources out there to kind of give you an idea, and you can compare where there might be discrepancies between them. And then as far as the U.S. stuff goes, I'm happy to provide a little bit of commentary about what I assess has actually been delivered versus just committed and outstanding still.
So Colby hit several of the notes I was going to. The few items I'll add on top of that are to note, if you want to find Oryx's list, if you were to Google search, I believe it's called something like heavy equipment for Ukraine. So if you type in Oryx heavy equipment Ukraine, that will draw you to that list, which again, but the timelines are very rough there. Colby referred to the account DE Aid UA, which is German aid to Ukraine. But I'll note that the German, in contrast with the United States, the German Ministry of Defense's list separates out in, its commitment or its aid in two big blocks of committed but not yet delivered and delivered. And so it's not clear why the U.S. doesn't do that, but you can actually look it up on the German source for their aid. The one other thing is I think it was last Sunday, maybe a week and a half ago. There was an account I found that actually had been maintaining a graph that also showed the timelines, like it was a timeline graph that showed when the commitment was made and when the delivery was made. And that was also projected out into the future for many of the major systems. It wasn't completely comprehensive, but if you did a quick search on my profile under, I think I may have labeled it in my agenda, something like committed versus delivered. So you can probably find the graph with that. Okay, I'll keep going. One last point on winter, sort of a couple of philosophical points, and then I'll move on to a couple of updates on the Black Sea. Okay, and perfect. I see that in the front of the nest exit included a tweet of mine that links to Oryx's heavy equipment list, so you can follow the link directly if you don't want to do the Google search. Okay, this last point about winter, it's the second tweet in the nest. Given the Ukrainians are talking about increasing their defenses of infrastructure, which is great news that they're thinking about it, I don't want to lose the fact that there is a humanitarian element, not only to future damage, but that in many places in Ukraine, the infrastructure has already been so damaged that there are people living there, but without proper access to utilities. They may have holes in their roofs, windows blown out, things like that are necessary to keep their homes livable through the winter. And so this is a tweet from the UN organization that's assisting in rebuilding some of these resources in an effort to help Ukrainians make it through the winter. There was a tweet, I haven't included it in the material, but there was a tweet in the last week where one of the people from the Ministry of Infrastructure noted all thermal power plants in Ukraine were functional, and that many of the heating plants were up, but that in particular there were 8 cities near the front line where central heating was not available. And it was more like an accounting. It wasn't a, hey, we're going to get them all up and running. It may not be feasible, but it was a, here's the scope of the problem. And the Ukrainians are on top of that. And if I can find the tweet, I'll put it up as well. Go ahead, Exit.
Just anecdotally, I know there are many of us here who talk to Ukrainians on a regular basis. And I know some of us, somebody was telling me earlier last week, I think it was, that there were people they knew who were still, they had had their homes damaged in a missile attack, and they were still waiting on replacement windows and other construction materials and things like that in order for their houses to be fixed. So that's not a small issue. And I don't know about everybody else, but at my house this week, temperatures have started to drop. It is most definitely moving into fall/winter, and this is going to be a much more important concern very, very quickly.
Absolutely. And I mean, without doxing you, you do live near the North Pole, so you are like the canary in the coal mine on that front. Okay. A couple of sort of strategic considerations from the last few days. these aren't all, hugely significant, but thought-provoking. I'll call them thought-provoking. Starting with the fourth item. So the fourth and fifth are connected. The fourth item is a tweet from Fabian Hoffman, who does great work. I believe he's literally a rocket scientist or a professor who does work with rocketry. So he does good threads on missile tech. And this thread is more about policy. And generally, I don't talk about the debate over risk of escalation toward nuclear exchange. And I'm only going to highlight it here just because it speaks to what's knowable and what's not knowable. And so Fabian set out a thread talking about how he thinks there's precedent in terms of what the West setting red lines, and that they'll enforce red lines against use of weapons of mass destruction. And the upshot is his saying that if the Russians were to escalate and use a weapon of mass destruction, then the Ukrainians would respond by sinking the Black Sea Fleet. This then goes into the fifth item back in the nest, where he got some pushback on that thread from several careful observers of the Russian military. So this is a tweet from Pavel Podvig. His handle is Russian Forces. And he's just saying, like, look, if the West could sink the Black Sea Fleet and hit all these command centers, why are they choosing not to do it now? And if a weapon of mass destruction were used, do the things that prevent the West from doing it now cease to be reasons that would stop them in future? And he's essentially implying that if you respond to escalation with this escalation, like, how do you play out the whole game? And that it's very difficult to see the end. So the only reason I've included this is these debates have been ongoing a long time. Fabian, I'm sure, has done this thread in good faith. He probably believes it's true. What I would assert is that it's unknowable to most of us. I mean, unless you're literally sitting in on the meetings where the United States is debating its potential responses, then we don't know. And it could be that alternatives have been drawn up, but that in fact nobody knows. They know what the alternatives are, but they don't know what decision would be made under the circumstances. And so I think people saying this is definitely how it will play out give people a false sense of security in terms of, oh, well, then that scenario will never happen. And this is not doomsaying so much as an emphasis on analytical rigor, and just admitting there are some things we don't know. And so anyway, just because there was debate on that in the spaces I was looking at, I thought I would raise it here. I'll pause for a moment and I'll go to hands. I see you're up. Do you want to go ahead, Sky Kiss?
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you for bringing me up. I have something to say about a special space and like a consortium that we're building to get Ukrainian defenders and Ukrainian citizens ready for the winter, but especially the defenders. And Tochny and several of the co-hosts for Tochny were in the meeting yesterday, and we are meeting again next Saturday. This is Dennis, who is hosting this, and if anyone's interested or has any input, any ideas, we're trying to start now to get them the gear they need for the winter. And you briefly touched on it, and I'm sorry I couldn't come up at that moment. And so I'm diverting us a little bit, just to state that we Dennis started a meeting yesterday, and he's doing his best. He's doing his best, and there were a lot of tears. So it's not military speak, but it's about getting the defenders ready for winter, because winter is coming. And as Exit said, and I'm in Colorado, and we hopefully we have some snow this year, because we didn't have much snow last year, and it got bitter cold like twice, not 10 times. So, that's just the thing that's going on worldwide. But anyway, we need to pull together. We had a number of the heads of the smaller fundraisers there in Europe join us. And as I said, Tochni co-hosts were there. Very interesting. I think we can, build a really good, strong effort here. And one of the areas, and maybe Colby can speak to this at some point, is what the U.S. military is going to be sending in the way of winter uniforms, if any. There was discussion, I think David D. Was discussing this in Tyler's space that may have been yesterday, it may have been Friday night, sorry. As most of us are underslept. So I'm working on it, though. Thank you so much for allowing me to put this out there, and appreciate everyone in the space, and very much appreciate all of your efforts, Michael. They're excellent. Thanks.
Well, that sounds like a worthwhile goal to work toward. And I guess it's lots of different people from the spaces are involved. So if you need more detail, I suppose you can reach out to SkyKiss, or it sounds like it's being talked about widely. So keep an eye on it. I know that last year I actually kept a thread that anytime there were aid announcements, I would look in that thread to see whether they included winter equipment, whether that be uniforms or, tents, sleeping bags, stoves, and the like. And so I kept a thread running just to say, hey, here's what Ukraine has asked for, and here's the sort of running tally of what countries have committed. The U.S. may have sent some, but I think a lot of the aid on that front came from Canada, Germany, the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries. Given they received so much of it last year, obviously it's something that needs to be replenished. But I would also assert that they're probably in better shape now than they were last year. But still, that sounds like a great initiative. Okay, two last points. Okay, before I get to those points, I'll go to exit, and then I'll wrap up the offensive stuff.
I was just going to comment on Fabian's thread, because I actually thought it did have some good points in it. I agree that we can't possibly know exactly what the response would be. But I think there's value in pointing out that the U.S. and Western allies have had a very specific response, and the fact that response was let's say it included a lot more munitions than it needed to in order to get the job done, if you read the reply or if you read the thread. And so it was kind of like they were putting a point on the fact that they didn't approve of the actions that Russia had taken. And I think there is value in pointing out that there is a red line there somewhere. It might not be where a lot of us want it to be, but understanding that has been communicated and backed up in the past is probably a useful thing to remember when we're watching what happens. But that is my personal opinion, and I know that some people in here don't necessarily agree with that.
Thanks for that. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, just one comment about the winter gear. A lot of people kind of forgot about the women last year when they were buying winter gear, especially women who are not petite, the larger ladies out there. Just that's something to keep in mind, that people come in all sorts of shapes and sizes.
I guess that begs the question whether, for military purposes, whether outside fundraising efforts can assist in that, or whether that's essentially a decision that must be made by, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So it's great to be mindful of it. I just don't know whether, you could like direct volunteer money toward uniforms for winter uniforms for ladies or not. I suppose if you have good enough connections, you could probably speak to the Ukrainians and find out. Go ahead, Exit.
If I remember correctly, I think it was 2 weeks ago that the Ukrainians had finally finalized their new version of gear for women in the Army. And I believe that they noted specifically that they were going to start with manufacturing the winter gear, but I will go back and try and find the actual source for that.
Yeah, I saw that as well. I didn't register the winter gear part of it, but that would make sense. Okay, these last two that are, when I think about the offensive, I try and include some overall political commentary on it. And so these last items, they're the sixth and seventh items in the nest. I found them intriguing. The first is a tweet by, so now they're the seventh and the eighth, tweet by Will Vernon, who is with the BBC. And he's passing along an article from the Financial Times. In this article, a retired British general is speaking about, in his view, the conditions that would be necessary for Ukraine to win. He suggests that victory is possible by 2024 or 2025. He lays out 5 items that he thinks would be necessary steps. I don't know if I'll be able to remember all 5 off the top of my head, but it was essentially that the Ukrainians not waste their manpower resources by pushing before they have the equipment means to achieve success. He talked about maintaining constant pressure on the Russians, about degrading Russian sort of their infrastructure and logistics networks. I believe his 4th point was that the Russian fleet in the Black Sea needed to be made a non-factor. He didn't speak specifically about how that would happen, but he did suggest it's something that he thought could be achieved by spring of 2024, for the purposes of their not being able to launch at will missile strikes on Ukraine, after that point. And then his 5th point, which is the one that most people focused on, was the ramp up in Western military industrial capacity. And we have lots of reports every week from Colby and friends of ours who are very focused on those capacity issues. But it's just interesting seeing it broken down in that way by a former general who remains optimistic about the potential and his estimates of, the sort of late 2024 to 2025 timeframe. The last item to highlight here, it's, I believe, the 8th item back now. It's a tweet from Bryn Tannehill, where she's talking about termination conditions, as in what could lead to an end in the fighting. And she's not talking about all the comprehensive possible outcomes, but she is saying, look, if there were a political change, whether just because Western allies want a particular outcome or potentially because of change in administration, saying that, look, the Ukrainians are going to keep fighting. And she outlines, Ukrainian opinion polls and various motivating factors to say, if the Ukrainians continue fighting and they continue fighting without Western support, in many ways it could be more dangerous because the Ukrainians have been fighting in a fairly conventional way with minimal striking across the Russian border, with use of these weapons in very specific ways, but that if they feel like their support is being reduced, they may use other means that could be more destabilizing, and that should also be taken into account. That you can't ultimately stop the Ukrainians, if they're determined to continue. And I think other people have said similar things. Maybe not all of these points, but I thought it was well argued. So I wanted to include it here for you to consider. Okay, the next set of material that I wanted to speak to are some quick updates on developments in the Black Sea. There were not huge changes. So, in the past, we've talked about actual strikes on the Kerch Bridge. We've talked about landings in Crimea. We've talked about, small boats or USV attacks on like the SIG oil tanker and the Russian landing ships. We haven't had anything like that in the last few days, but there have definitely been some interesting items. So hopefully I'm going to rely on my co-host Exit to help me out with some of her analysis here. The items should come up in the nest in just a moment. The first of which, even though we didn't see the result of any attack on the Kerch Bridge, there were claims that another attack was attempted. So the first tweet, it's from Exit. She was summarizing what are Russian reports. And so the Russians yesterday claimed that 3 USVs attempted to approach the bridge. The Russian, again, this is all with a grain of salt because it's coming from the Russian Ministry of Defense. But they were saying that there were 3 attempts between 11:15 p.m. local time and 2:30 in the morning. And their claim is that they destroyed all 3 of the drones before they got to the bridge. But then interestingly, there was this one claim that one of the drones, I guess upon realization that they were being searched for or targeted, then took the opportunity to reverse course and proceed back. On either side of the bridge, there are these anchor areas where ships have to wait because the rate of traffic flow through the channel under the bridge is limited. And so there are these essentially, parking lots where you have to wait your turn. And the Russians asserted that one of the drones turned around and went back toward that anchor area, suggesting they may have attempted to hide. I'm not sure what to make of any of that, but the Russians claim that ultimately they detected it and destroyed it. But again, these are all Russian claims. I'm not sure exactly what to make of it. But Exit, what do you think?
So first off, the detail about the USB possibly turning back was actually a Rybar post. And so obviously I would take it with even more grain of salt than a lot of other things that you see out there. I am not sure what to make of all of it. First off, if you look at the cycle of the moon, which is like oddly something we pay attention to when we look at USB attacks, because generally it's actually quite indicative of whether or not Ukraine is running USB attacks or not. It was nearly a full moon last night, and that is not typically when we would see Ukraine running USB attacks. If you look at the weather, the seas weren't small, but they weren't really big either. They were under 1 meter swells. That's still a little bit higher than what we typically see for USB attacks. It doesn't entirely make sense that a USB would turn back specifically, because they're one-way machines. Like, they're not meant to come back and return to their home port. They wouldn't have enough fuel for that. They wouldn't have lots of things that they need to get that done. They would almost certainly be hunted down somewhere in the middle of that whole expedition. However, the one theory that I had thought of, and I'm not sure if anybody else has thoughts on this, I'm happy to hear them and discuss it, but if it was supposedly the middle USV that turned back and supposedly hit amongst the anchorage, and then the report says it was destroyed kind of out to the east of the anchorage area in a specific cape. And it says it was destroyed after it tried to take a run at one of the boats that was chasing it, one of the Russian boats that was chasing it. The only thing that kind of makes sense to me, and that I've been trying to kind of hunt down with some of the other sources that I have, is whether or not it was trying to draw away some of the defending boats, the Russian defending boats of the Kerch Bridge, so that the third USB could make a specific attack. That is entirely speculation, and there are people that I've talked to that don't believe that that's necessarily what happened. So I think there's the general gist of it is there's a lot of questions. If this actually happened, and there's lots of us still looking for evidence, if it actually happened, then it does point to something new that we haven't seen Ukrainian USVs do before. But we just have more questions than answers right now. And if anybody has some of those answers or sees more reports of that particular attack, I would love to see them. Please DM me.
And just a reminder that it's entirely possible that none of this happened. But just to be clear, like, you know, when we go through these discussions, we are not a news outlet. So we're not only picking things that are perfectly confirmed. The process of, open source intelligence analysis is not just, we're reporting what's true. It's what methods can we find to evaluate the correctness, accuracy of pieces of information that come across. And so, when we build kind of an idea of a pattern of behavior, this story isn't totally impossible. It just has some things that aren't consistent with past incidents, and we don't have enough evidence for it. But it's still important to raise these items because partly it puts you guys, the audience, in the position of, hey, can you feed us information? And it twigs you to, oh, this is an open mystery. Maybe I should be paying particular attention here. We're not just talking about, it's not irresponsible to discuss speculation as long as you're running it through filters to evaluate whether it's true or not, rather than taking it at face value. Okay, a few more Black Sea items. The second item back. It looks like there are continuing diplomatic efforts to try to get Russia to resume engagement in some way along the lines of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I would give Turkey credit here because it seems like they're investing some diplomatic resources into pursuing this. And in particular, there was speculation, and Exit does a great job in this thread, the second item in the nest, at noting there is talk, I'll put it that way, there is talk about the Russian Agricultural Bank being reconnected to SWIFT, the interbank messaging system in the West. That has been a Russian request for a long time, as is their request that certain assets, including fertilizer that were sitting in European ports, be released. My understanding is that in these ongoing discussions, those concessions weren't expressly agreed to, but the implication is that, they're entertaining these Russian requests. Exit, did I miss anything on that point? Essentially, it's just the talks are ongoing, right?
The talks are ongoing. This, I believe, presented the same UN proposal that was actually presented at the very end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in the last iteration of it. And it remains very unclear how they would actually meet any of the demands that Russia has. If they were to do that, it would have to be in conjunction with the EU being willing to lift some of the sanctions on the fertilizer and possibly reconnect the European subsidiary of the Agricultural Bank. There was talk at the end of the last renewal period that the EU may be willing to do that, but we never really got any actual details on that. All of which is unfortunate. And I don't think anybody really wants to actually see this happen. but there is pressure internally in Russia on Putin, reportedly, to kind of have some kind of a grain deal in effect, because it essentially would also secure Russian exports out of their Black Sea ports, essentially saying, like, if Russia isn't going to attack Ukrainian exports, then Ukraine isn't likely to attack Russian exports. Kind of the quid pro quo idea is what is the theory that most people are working on. And it's unfortunate that it looks like we probably will end up heading this way, mostly because the Ukrainian, as I mentioned earlier, the Ukrainian option for a corridor of their own, which would be great if people actually, like if shippers actually were going to use that corridor, but nobody has taken Ukraine up on that to actually bring ships in and load them with cargo and bring them back out. And part of the reason for that is because Russia keeps attacking Ukrainian ports, not even just the Odessa area ports, but they're also attacking the Danube River ports now. So they're kind of putting a point on the idea that they aren't going to continue to allow grain exports in the way that they were, or possibly any exports in the way that they were previously. And that's really making shippers take a second guess at whether or not they're willing to work with the Ukrainian proposal for a corridor, which unfortunately kind of takes us back to square one and needing to find some solution to get the grain out in a more economical way. And unfortunately, this seems to be a solution that actually has a chance for success. However, the hope is that whatever the proposal that the UN has put out there would actually have some measurables. So like if Russia isn't doing inspections or isn't guaranteeing enough ships actually leave Ukraine and leave the initiative, then maybe there would be some kind of pushback on Russia or something to hold them accountable for those numbers. Because obviously that was the problem with the last iteration with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that Russia could just essentially stop doing inspections and there was nothing to hold them accountable for that. So I would say nobody who's watching this likes where it's headed, except for maybe Russia. I'm not even sure that Russia really likes where it's headed, but it might be one of the few solutions that are moderately workable for the time being.
In addition to the, unpalatable but possibly necessary changes on the fertilizer and ports and the connection of that bank, one thing that caught my attention is in your thread, which is the 5th back in the nest, in your thread discussing the Ukrainians' proposal for a new shipping corridor of their own, not the Black Sea Grain Initiative resumption. In that proposal, the conditions for transiting the corridor didn't specify it would only be for grain. So the idea would be potentially it would allow other types of exports. However, if they, for greater certainty, do resume something like the Black Sea Grain Initiative, presumably that would apply only to grain and therefore exclude the possibility of export of general cargoes, right?
So none of us have seen what the UN proposed. So off the top, we just don't know for sure. I wouldn't be so sure that that's exactly what the proposal details and that it's only limited to grain. It's my understanding that there was always a hope and expectation by the UN and Turkey that they would broaden the export abilities of the initiative. And right before the initiative ended, the original initiative ended, we actually saw the UN kind of signal this in a way, specifically by when they were talking about the renewal, they took the word grain out of their description of the initiative. They just kept referring to it as the Black Sea Initiative, not the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So I would suggest that there is room for this to be a much broader initiative, and it might be that there are enough other pressure points that maybe they can broaden that with Russia, but we just don't know because nobody's actually seen the proposal.
Yep, fair point. And I know you highlighted the dropping of the word grain before and thought that was intriguing and maybe significant. So we'll see how that bet between you and I plays out. The last two items coming out of the Black Sea, we've essentially alluded to them. They've been pushed back in the nesta ways, so they're now let's see how quickly I can count, 7th and 8th back. But just updates that just last night, there were continued Russian drone strikes on Danube port infrastructure. So you can see reports on that from the tweet by Kendo Nagasaki. So, those are ongoing. Presumably, if some kind of deal were resumed, Russia would have to once again refrain from striking that infrastructure. But until a deal is reached, it seems like they're determined to continue. The 8th item in there is just a note that 2 more ships had departed. I believe they were in Odessa, I think, rather than one of the other 2 Ukrainian ports, and that they have now departed using that same corridor with no problem in their departure. So I think is that now 4 or 5 that have departed? And it seems like the Russians haven't been interested in trying to interfere with those ships.
There was 2 more. There's 4 altogether that have left. One of the last 2 was actually from the Yuzhny port, and the other one was from Odessa. Yes. So there's 3. There's technically 3 general cargo ships that are still in 2 of the Odessa area ports. Only 2 of them are reporting AIS right now, so I don't expect the 3rd one to actually move anytime soon. And we haven't seen any movement on the AIS for the 2 that are remaining and have their AIS on. So it wouldn't be in the next 2 days that we would see them move.
Okay. But, you in particular, but you along with others are keeping a close eye on it, which is great news. And hopefully there will be some progress on deal making in the near future. And just before we move off the Black Sea, just a reminder that if you guys hear anything more about those alleged drone strikes that were attempted near the Kerch Bridge 2 days ago, do pass it along to Exit. Okay, I wanted to move on to some updates now on Ukrainian equipment. And I think after equipment, I'll get into some updates on economics. Because we don't have a guest today, we'll probably get deeper in the agenda, maybe touching on some economics and diplomacy, which we often miss out on. So beginning on the Ukrainian equipment updates, the first item in the nest is just a thoughtful thread from our friend John Ridge, who pays very close attention to missile tech. And there has been so much discussion about long-range strike programs that he's developed a longer thread to explain what they all are. And that the major programs are the Neptune, the Sapsan, and the Korshan. And he goes into the details of them, just so you get a better understanding. And this falls, into the context of Ukraine talking about developing at least one system that has a 700-kilometer capacity, likely a drone system, and reporting coming out of the New York Times that among the other drone systems under development, they're working on one with a range of 1,000 kilometers. So this is to fill out the details there. John is great on missile tech. So check out the thread and consider giving John a follow. The second item, we got a little bit more detail for those who are really into the weeds on equipment about the model of the AIM-120s that would be provided. And there was discussion that came out of this new contract procurement that the United States signed, some of which is for the United States to replenish its own stocks, but some of which is expected to go to Ukraine. And apparently Colby in this tweet was speculating it's likely to be the C8 model, but I think there was subsequent reporting that noted it was the C8 and also a few of the D model. And I think there are nuances in terms of between those models, some of them can be used with NASAMS, some are outfitted so they'll work with F-16s. I think, well, rather than my speculating or trying to remember, we'll go to Colby.
Thanks. So it's, in my view, very unlikely that Ukraine's getting any Delta 3s because those are pretty much just reserved for the United States, and there may be export clearance granted for a couple other countries, but I don't think that that's even been validated. C8 is the main foreign military sales model, and it doesn't really matter that much, especially for Ukraine, which one they're getting, because they're quite similar, quite comparable. The challenge for them is that NASAMS can use any of these, so that it doesn't have any impact there. But the difficulty is that the F-16s are not going to be able to take full advantage of the maximum range of these new built AMRAAMs because the radars on the F-16s are just not powerful enough to see out to the maximum possible range that the missile's capable of flying.
Which actually leads into the next tweet in the nest, where there was a bit of a back and forth between some accounts that pay attention to equipment. You could even say it was a knockdown, drag-out fight about whether these new AIM-120s would, considerably extend Ukraine's ability to intercept Russian planes in the air. Some people had been circulating a map saying, hey, here's the front line, here's 120 or more kilometers from it. This is the range where Russia will now be at risk. And so to Colby's point, not all of those systems can reach out to that range. And then the reason I added this as a separate item was there was some debate over this IBCS, which is a new battlefield management system that is supposed to integrate sensors and missile launching platforms. And then the debate was about, well, what impact would that IBCS have? Was it actually provided? It hasn't been formally announced, but we'll go to Colby for the details.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine received one engagement operations center of an IBCS. They didn't even receive all the different components of it. So people are really overestimating the significance of what that's going to be able to do for them. I mean, it is very important. It's significant that it's been provided, and my assessment would be that it probably got provided with the Patriot system, which was announced in December or January. So it's there, but Ukraine is not. That's not going to allow Ukraine to do the things that people are suggesting it will. For the reasons I outlined in my tweet, and people can go look at that and look at the original post that I made, noting that the map that was being floated here is just completely unrealistic, devoid of reality. This is not how things work. You can't just draw lines on a map and say, oh yeah, this missile can fly 120 kilometers. So now, Russia has to stay out of that bubble. That's just completely asinine. That's not the correct way to view air-to-air missiles. That can be applicable for a ground-launched surface-to-surface system. You can measure maximum possible range that way, but it doesn't work like that for an air-to-air missile because you're shooting at a moving target that's moving potentially above the speed of sound, right? So you have to detect the target, and then you have to lock on, fire the missile. The missile has to fly there. So it's the idea that a map like that is conveying is just not. It does not comport with reality of how an air-to-air engagement actually works. So it's beyond misinformation. People that put out those kinds of maps should not be taken seriously at all. They're doing a huge disservice to the Ukrainian cause by misinforming people about what's happening in this war.
In that it builds up expectations that are just unrealistic, and then people will be frustrated when it doesn't play out in the simple way it's presented. Okay. Moving to the first item in the nest. This one's just a novelty. it was a video that showed that Ukraine, in some of its heaviest drone systems, are quadcopter, or I guess I should say rotorcraft, are now dropping anti-tank landmines, which I think one account noted, okay, well, that's like 7.5 kilo. So what is that? Like 16 pounds of explosives. So that's a pretty hefty drone dropped explosive. The reason I'm bringing it up is because I had a quick exchange with Wolverine, who many of you will know, who saw this and said, well, wait a minute, does that even make sense? How is it detonated? You know, because a mine is being detonated by huge amounts of pressure on its fuse, and you're not going to get that dropping it from the sky. You'll note in the video, it shows at the beginning they've drilled a hole in the side of the mine, and they screw in a fuse from a grenade. And so when it's dropped, the pin, by the force of the mine being dropped, the pin is pulled out because it's tied to the drone's body, and that's the detonator. But then Wolverine also said, well, wait a minute, this thing's not aerodynamic, right? If you drop it from any kind of a height, you can't aim it. It doesn't have fins. And I think, that's a great point. He's absolutely right. My assumption is it's going to be used against potentially fortifications, trench lines, and the like, where you just need more explosives. But maybe there's some detail I'm missing on how they plan to deploy it. Andrew, go ahead.
I don't know anything about this particular mine that you're talking about, but I would direct people to watch the K2 battalion videos, because they use these like pancake-shaped mines that are not aerodynamic at all. They're like they're shaped like they're shaped like a mine, but they're bombs dropped from their drones, and they're absolutely gigantic explosions. And they drop them with ridiculous precision because it's just like this like coin falling out of the sky, and it goes all over the place, and then somehow magically hits whatever they're aiming at. I'm sure it takes them a ton of tries to actually hit stuff, but Ukraine has been using ridiculously difficult to aim bombs for a while, and the K2 battalion puts out a lot of videos of destroying stuff with it. They've taken out mortar positions, they've taken out anti-tank guns, they've taken out like BTRs, like all sorts of stuff. So you can go watch their videos. They're on YouTube, and they have a Telegram. So if you're interested, you can watch them drop those silly bombs.
Interesting. Well, I'll have to direct Wolverine to that. And so again, that's the K2 battalion. Okay. Couple more updates. Some of these are just like a grab bag of interesting things. The second item in the nest was an interview on Ukrainian television, where I believe this is a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force. And what was discussed here was the Ukrainians apparently saying that they have now decided on their priority for combat aircraft. And in this interview, they're saying that order is F-16 being the most desirable, then the Gripen, which, we've heard reports that Ukrainian pilots are doing sort of evaluation trials on. Then in third, they had the Eurofighter Typhoon, and then in fourth, the Rafale French aircraft. And it's not on that list. There was a comment about a week ago where Zelensky was visiting Finland, and he had even speculated about Ukraine being willing to accept Finnish F-18s. But anyway, a lot of what I had heard previously was either silence from the Ukrainians on what aircraft they preferred, or sort of an explicit statement of, we would love any help we can get. So it's interesting now that several F-16s have been committed, and there's this evaluation process on the Gripen, that Ukraine is sort of coming out and making it known what they would prefer. We briefly discussed on Thursday, Zelensky in an interview had talked about Ukraine hoping to get up to 160 F-16s, of which it's believed at the moment the number committed is somewhere between 50 and 60. So there's still a ways to go to fill their the number that they're hoping for with their number one preferred airframe. The third item is a new counter UAV system that's being provided. It's in the tweet from, I believe it's military in Ukraine. And it's called the Slinger. I believe this is like a module that you can affix. It's sort of like a remote weapon system, but it's sort of optimized for use as against UAV systems. So that's great news. They're talking about providing 160 of these. I'm not sure on timing, but I suspect those details are probably included in the article. The fourth and fifth items back relate to the same incident. This is just an update as a reminder, because I kind of grouped news together by theme. And so this is sort of the drone theme. And this tweet from OSINT Technical is highlighting that TB2s, the Bayraktars, which we haven't seen a lot of recently, are still flying. They're being used for both recon, and it's unclear in this case if it was only recon or simultaneously attack. But it was an attack on a Russian patrol ship as it's unloading. And, you know, I guess, like, trigger warning, I generally don't present videos that include death in them. That's in this video in case you don't want to watch it. But it's just interesting to see that the TB2s are still up and being made use of. In connection with that video, for those who want to help out in sort of crowdsourcing OSINT, the sixth item back, the tweet by H.I. Sutton, he was trying to identify precisely what kind of boat was the Russian boat that was destroyed. If you read down the thread, I think he's narrowed it pretty closely down. But it's interesting because the initial reports as to model didn't appear to be correct. And I appreciate that, you know, Sutton specializes in naval matters. And so when he looks at it, he doesn't just take it for granted. He says, no, that doesn't look right. Let's figure out specifically what it was. And then he sort of put a public call out for it, which just goes to show even experts can draw on the wisdom of the crowd. Go ahead, Exit.
So I put a link up in the nest to the K2 Battalion YouTube channel that Andrew had mentioned, but I also had another question for the space generally. If I know that I haven't seen a lot of videos for TB2s up until the last 2 weeks, and it seems like the last 2 weeks we've seen 3 or 4 of them come out, and that seems different than what we had been seeing in the past. And I wondered if there was anybody in the space that had insight into that, or if maybe that's just what I'm seeing and other people have noticed a different trend or anything. I would love to hear anybody's input on that.
Well, it's something that I don't really think should be talked about. How the TB2s have been used, but yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Well, then maybe we'll keep our comments on it brief, but Colby, go ahead.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I would just say that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So, you know, the fact that we haven't seen a lot of videos of TB2s doesn't mean that the TB2s haven't been doing things, just means the Ukrainians haven't wanted to put that out there. And as far as these specific videos that came out today, and those are the first that I recall seeing in quite a long time, I would personally offer too much commentary without any geolocations being done to actually have an idea of where those strikes actually happened, to try and pontificate about any wider implications of why we might be seeing those videos now. So I would just leave it at that.
I did see some commentary in response to it saying, hey, when were these videos taken? One indication was that it may have been the Russians landing in the, quote, northwestern Black Sea, which would imply it may have been a while ago before the retreat from Kherson. So it's not. I'm not saying the video is recent necessarily. It's just interesting that we hadn't seen TB2s for quite a while, and I wanted to use it to set up H.I. Sutton's request for assistance in identifying the boat. Okay, so we did missile tech, we did drones, moving on to some land systems. The first item in the nest, Colby pays great attention to various new contracts that come in. So this first item is a contract for the order of M88, which are these the large U.S. recovery vehicles. And the suggestion here is that the 8 of them have been provided to Ukraine so far. 74 million would buy way more than just 8. And so the suggestion is this contract is likely not merely for replacement, but that some of the additional vehicles may make their way to Ukraine, which is encouraging. But again, it's not explicitly included in the statement. The second item back is, whenever there's a photo that comes out that's the first spotting of a piece of equipment, I always like to highlight that. In this case, this is the first instance where a Bradley equipped with the BFIST system, which is the Bradley Fire Support Team system. Apparently, it's the first photo of it in Ukraine. My very shallow understanding of it is that it's a system that's used for targeting, so that data can be used for indirect fire from friendly vehicles. So it seems like it's primarily a sensor package, not that it itself, is specially equipped in terms of armament, but that we've heard lots of reports of the Ukrainians using many different direct fire weapons in indirect fire mode. And so this seems sort of in keeping with their strategy more broadly. And in this case, it's a system that's, pretty sophisticated and set up for that end. The third item is there are now reports that there will be another presidential drawdown package announced in the coming week. And the story from Reuters, highlighted by Colby, is that this will be the first package in which the United States will be sending tank ammunition that includes depleted uranium. The UK has sent this previously. There was lots of back and forth about the characteristics of depleted uranium that we don't need to get into very much at the moment, but it's interesting the U.S. has decided to send these. I presume this is because the Abrams are anticipated on the battlefield in the coming weeks. There were reports that the first 10 would be provided in just a few weeks from now. And it's great that there will be another presidential drawdown, because we've also talked about how there are still $5 billion in authorized PDA funds that will expire, is the understanding, at the end of September. So you never know. Hopefully this might be a more substantial PDA than is normally the case. Colby, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say on the depleted uranium rounds, the reporting on this is that the Pentagon was actually strongly in favor of providing these. And to the extent that this was a decision being debated, it seems to be a lot less contentious than some of the other decisions about providing certain weapon systems to Ukraine. The cluster munitions decision was obviously much more contentious, but apparently the Pentagon was pretty adamant that the Abrams were not going to be very effective if they didn't receive the armor-piercing Sabo rounds with depleted uranium. So it's not too surprising that we're seeing this, especially given that the United Kingdom has already provided the ammunition as well. And
we, not that it's necessarily tied to the munitions type, but I know there was an article out today where some Ukrainians were citing the Challenger as being the sniper rifle equivalent of tanks, and that they're definitely appreciating them. I think they had said something like, if we had another company or two, that Russian tanks would, be very afraid to come out and engage. So it sounds like Western tanks are being appreciated. It'll be interesting to see how the Abrams get deployed on the battlefield. The two more points in the equipment before we move on to some conversation about econ diplomacy. The fourth item back, in the last week or so, we've heard several reports that one area the Ukrainians seem like they have a significant need equipment-wise is for armored ambulances, armored sort of medical response. Several big accounts, I think Thomas Tyner and some others highlighted this. This is speculative, but this fourth tweet back from Evgen Vorobyov, Zelensky said just a few days ago that an unnamed foreign donor is going to be providing Ukraine with more armored medical evacuation vehicles. I don't know whether that, was set up quickly in response to the calls for urgent need, but whether it is or not, it's great that need seems like it's going to make some progress. Hopefully it will fill most of it, and we'll kind of keep our eyes on a request for it. There is talk about there were several systems that fill that niche. The the M11, what are they, M1113s, and the YPR, I think, is a similar system. So it's not clear what vehicle will be provided, but we'll keep our eyes open to see if we can detect them appearing on the battlefield. Go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. Final thing for me, and then I'm going to drop and get ready for dinner. So, as you note in this tweet, Evgen notes that the M113s are favorites among medics of those brigades lucky enough to have them, quote. And when it was first announced that the United States was going to provide the M113, and we've also seen lots of other countries provide M113s and M113 derived vehicles, it was the most ubiquitous armored personnel carrier of NATO militaries and U.S. aligned militaries during the Cold War. So there's just massive quantities of these things. But when it was first announced that they were going to be sent over, a lot of people were saying, oh, geez, like we're really giving Ukraine old junk from the bottom of the barrel. Like these things are no good. Why would they want them? And it's been interesting to see that a lot of equipment that some of the sort of military commentariat has written off has turned out to be quite popular among Ukrainian forces. And this is one vehicle that has been, despite, shortcomings and that it's not particularly well armored. I always say it beats walking or beats being in a completely unarmored truck. So I certainly hope that we'll see more of these be sent, because the United States still has quite deep reserves of these vehicles. And in another bit of very important related procurement news, over the last month, BAE US has been awarded over $500 million in contracts to produce armored multi-purpose vehicles, which is the vehicle that is replacing the M113 in US service. And before the war, Congress had actually cut the funding allocated to that program, so it wasn't going to be produced at a full rate. But because the United States has been providing these old M113s to Ukraine, that has enabled the administration to use the replacement funds to up their buys of the AMPAV and put it back into full rate production. So the United States very much has the capacity to deliver a lot more of these to Ukraine, because they have the AMPV in full rate production now, so they can backfill all of those potential donations of that system. And to the extent that other countries are interested in the AMPV themselves, the production is there to deliver those new vehicles and enable countries to donate their old M113s to Ukraine. And even if they're not already in an armored ambulance configuration, you can they can strip them out and, try and set them up in the field to do that role. So hopefully we see more of those being sent, because I have seen a lot of other accounts talking about the need for more armored ambulance vehicles to help reduce casualty ratios and get troops, the proper medical care that they need as soon as possible.
It may have been one of the same threads we both saw, but the claim was that because of ongoing, artillery bombardment, these armored vehicles are particularly important because they'll delay attempts to transfer the wounded, to higher level medical care, unless there are armored systems available that can, take the risk of proceeding while there's still a sort of active combat ongoing. And I would also presume that the M113s, given they're quite old pieces of equipment for the United States, if they're valuing them, using a measure that accounts for their depreciation, that they wouldn't bite very deeply into committed funds, because they would probably be fairly inexpensive given their age. But anyway, we'll have to keep an eye on that and follow up, see where they come from, see what's provided. Last point on these ground vehicles, the sixth item in the nest, tweet from Mikhailo Fedorov. And Mikhailo is, I believe he's a deputy prime minister of Ukraine, and his primary portfolio is digital, digital integration, I think. And so he's highlighting the use of unmanned ground vehicles, and many of which are shown off in this video here. And he's talking about how essentially they're going from testing and these sort of drone conventions that are doing trials, to the point where they're now handing some of these over to units, and that they may be working, they're nearing work on the front line. And in this case, he talks about 25 different combat turrets and 5 different ground platforms. By ground platforms, I presume he's talking about UGVs that may be used for cargo, transit, medical evacuation, and the like. So it's it's interesting. It's a brave new world. We have seen the Russians. They had an arms show last week where they showed off several of their own attempts at these vehicles, but it doesn't seem like they're maybe as close to moving them toward the front line. If you'd like to check out what the Russians were working on, go to the account of our friend Sam Bendet, who did a long thread on all the equipment presented at that Arms Expo. Okay, let me see here. Yeah, I think was one more thing added to the front of the nest. Let me just check. Nope, we're all set. Okay. So I'm going to move into some updates on economics, which we don't often get into. Some of these happened over the last week or so. They're not all totally brand new, because I've been rolling some of the news items forward, keeping the most relevant in at each step. But hopefully it generates some conversation, so we don't often get into it. Just bear with me as I put these items up in the nest. The first bits of news relate to a criminal investigation that's begun against a Ukrainian oligarch who goes by the name of Kolomoisky. And the info should pop up in the nest in just a moment. So the first tweet links to an article from the Financial Times that covers the background of Kolomoisky. And he's been accused of corruption and related crimes for quite a while now by the Ukrainian government. He has interests in media and energy and banking. In particular, several years ago, the bank that he co-owned announced that it was missing assets and it had a gap in its balance sheet. And that gap amounted to $5.5 billion US. The implication being that funds may have been embezzled over the course of many years, and perhaps it was papered over until it couldn't be ignored anymore when the amount was finally made public. Given that Kolomoisky stands accused of involvement in crimes that could potentially, run to the millions or more. The initial charges against him relate to some, just narrower sets of charges. In particular, with regard to his involvement with Naftagaz, which is a Ukrainian energy company that's primarily state-run, but that he was in charge of managing at the time. And the allegation is that he moved assets out of it, and that he's now being investigated for fraud and money laundering. And Naftagaz earlier this year wound up being nationalized in any event. And so Kolomoisky gets attention, beyond the fact that the government has talked about it investigating him for quite a while. Apparently, his media enterprises include the television outlet that used to run the comedies that Zelensky appeared in. And when Zelensky ran, Kolomoisky was one of his backers. And so there are elements here of that are fairly sensitive, including a political angle. And my understanding is that he not only is he being investigated, but that his home was raided. He's currently in custody. He appeared in court. So if you have a look at the second item in the nest, just by way of evidence, that's footage of him in court. And apparently he was ordered to be held for, I believe, 15 months pending bail. So we'll see how this all plays out. This comes after we've talked about some of the Ministry of Defense corruption scandals regarding food pricing. We've talked about winter equipment, the winter jacket pricing. We talked about Zelensky dismissing the heads of the military medical commissions. So it seems like, a lot of these may have been a long time coming, but that there is a particularly big push on now to address issues of corruption that have long persisted, to be very clear that they're trying to root it out entirely. So I interpret this as good news. I'm not highlighting it to focus on the corruption so much as to focus on the anti-corruption activities. So related to that, the third item in the nest, Ukrainian officials have now come out in this Kiev Independent article, and the Justice Minister has talked about how Ukraine is now seeking to extradite from other countries corrupt Ukrainian officials, and that they're going to focus on those who had the biggest, dollar impact initially. This is not a surprise. It's part of the ongoing anti-corruption push. They are not suspending these some might argue that they wouldn't have as much resources to pursue these things during the war, but clearly they think it's an important part of their overall political strategy, which includes dealing with these issues because it may become relevant, for example, in their efforts to join the European Union. Interestingly, in talking about extradition, we highlighted, I think it may have been 2 months ago now, that Ukrainian extradition attempts have not always been successful. There was an instance where I can't remember the name of the individual, but he's one of the oligarchs who owned a significant share in a Ukrainian bank who stood accused of financial crimes. And he is living in France, and the French courts rejected the extradition request, essentially asserting that the French courts were not confident that the accused could receive a fair trial in Ukraine under the conditions of the war, which was fairly controversial at the time. So I'm just highlighting that, not because I agree with the French courts, but to express that in some cases, Ukraine may face a bit of an uphill fight to succeed in these extradition cases. Exit, go ahead.
Since I don't know the answer to this, and maybe others don't either, if they extradite corrupt officials back to Ukraine, can they make a claim on their funds held in other countries as well?
Well, so without getting into it too technically, I mean, if an order has been placed by a court to seize funds of an individual, Ukraine can seek to have the courts of the foreign country recognize their court order for the purposes of enforcement by the police, executive, or whoever of that foreign country. Now, if it were just, like a civil case, where it would be on grounds that most countries' civil law would recognize, like if they were suing them for damages, that would probably be fairly straightforward. In an instance where they're seizing the funds by sort of an act of the Ukrainian legislature, that might be under powers that don't have equivalents in the foreign country. So I don't know that it's always that easy, or even if they're to be successful, they have to make an argument before these foreign courts that may be more novel, explaining why the Ukrainian legislature has taken those steps. And it would probably be assisted by the fact that usually the legislature doesn't just say, we are seizing these funds, but they set up criteria by which funds may be seized, and then individual court orders would need to be obtained under those laws from the courts in Ukraine, which means there's a separate, case-by-case review process, which might make it easier. But the point is that it's not, like, mechanisms definitely exist, but depending on the laws of the country in which you're trying to enforce it and sort of their degree of skepticism, you may have to make a longer explanation of the legal authority that the Ukraine is using. And in many of these cases, these individuals who have left the country, their assets within Ukraine were frozen and in some cases seized, long ago or much earlier in the war. And so when we're talking about their assets, usually their assets in Ukraine have already been addressed or used. And their only remaining assets would be their foreign ones. I suspect it will be a long process of chasing these down, in that some of these individuals would likely have spread their assets out over multiple jurisdictions. So it's not just like that one individual living in France. It's not just going to the French courts and enforcing an order there. They may own property in France, they may own property in Germany, Italy. And so all of that is time consuming. I suspect they're pursuing the individuals for extradition because they're looking for justice and to show justice being done more than they are concerned about the asset seizure. I'm sure they'll pursue that in time. So continuing, because I grouped these together, this subject was addressing corruption and its impact on the economy. The fourth and fifth items in the nest are just to highlight that Ukraine is working with Western partners on a variety of anti-corruption programs, which is terrific. So the fourth is the director of the FBI was meeting with the Ukrainian director of its National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Then the fifth item was the U.S. coordinator for global anti-corruption with the U.S. State Department was meeting with the Ukrainian High Anti-Corruption Court. So you can see that Ukraine has both a bureau for anti-corruption and a specific court to deal with corruption cases. In both cases, working on cooperation with the United States. The last item in sort of this block on corruption, the sixth tweet back from Bill Browder, linking to a Financial Times article that talks about, it's an interview with Andrei Melnichenko, who was one of, I believe, Ukraine's richest man, or I'm sorry, I've misspoken, who was a Russian oligarch. I believe he may have been the wealthiest man in Russia, and before the war broke out. And while this person isn't wanted, in the way we were talking about seeking extradition, so it wasn't a completely adversarial interview. Apparently, it cast him in quite a negative light, talking about the nature of shared responsibility among Russians. Trying to say, oh, well, everybody bears a little bit of the responsibility. But then when he was individually asked, well, what do you think your responsibility is? He said, well, none. And so even though he's now living abroad, I I suspect that, profiles like this will not do much to raise his standing in the societies of, the country he's moved to, and that a lot of these oligarchs are finding trouble in maintaining their social status, even in countries that had been quite friendly to them previously. Okay, the next section goes to export controls and their impact on the economic strategies. I'm just waiting to make sure everything's come up, populated in the nest. So the first of which is an article. It's a little over a week old now. It's in the tweet by Michael Weiss, who writes for Yahoo News, among others. Okay, good. It's come up now. So this was a big profile written by The Insider, which is a Russian news outlet that is, I believe they're now publishing from Europe, outside of Russia, profiling the delivery of, profiling the re-export of electronic systems from EU countries to Russia. Many of the quite well-known electronic companies like Texas Instruments devices and similar microchips. So when this came down, it caused a bit of a splash, highlighting that, it's a major ongoing problem. And in many of these cases, it's a lack of enforcement. In others, it's that some of these are dual use and they're not strictly prohibited yet. The second item back, though, goes to show the ability of Russia to attain these electronics. And so our friend, Sam Bendet, found this article from Tom's Hardware that notes Russia has now announced the commissioning, or the finalizing of construction of a new supercomputer that appears to run primarily on chips coming from Western providers, which is leading some to beg the question, how is it possible that they can be purchasing all these chips, some of which may have been acquired before the export controls came into place. But I suspect that's an example of something that's going to lead to specific investigation to find out how they got all those specialized chips. However, there has been some success in cracking down on people trying to get around these export controls. Interestingly, these two cases, one is in Germany, the other relates to a German citizen. So the first, there's a tweet by Fidelius Schmid, but that just links out to an article from the German newspaper Der Spiegel that talks about how the former CEO of a machine tools company has been arrested by German authorities because they provided these precision tools to a company in Russia that manufactures sniper rifles. And so this is one of the first instances I've heard of somebody being specifically arrested for breaching these export controls. In a related note, the fourth item back, it's the tweet by Shashank Joshi. And so this links to the Financial Times article where Germany has arrested an individual who was providing electronics that are used by Russia in its drones to Russia. And I suppose I'm realizing now there may actually have been a third case, I think, that took place in Cyprus, where there was a connection. They were buying electronics from a German source, I think, sorting them through Cyprus and passing them on to Russia. So there have been several, at least these two in Germany, and I think a third instance of arrests outside Germany for sanctions evasion, which is good to see. We are pretty regularly seeing the Treasury Department in the United States press charges and apply new sanctions in an effort to shut down sanctions evasion networks. But for the most part, those charges aren't leading to arrests because most of the people are outside the country. So it's interesting to see the Europeans actually arresting some of their own citizens and pursuing the charges against them. The next set of material I'll get into relates to the use of frozen assets. So there's one here, and I'll put the next block of material up in a moment. But that fifth item, it's an article from the Kyiv Independent. So first of all, this is the Ukrainian perspective. And so this is a conversation from Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal about Ukraine's intention to use Russian assets that it seized within its own country. So in this case, I don't believe that we're talking about, we're partly talking about assets that are frozen outside the country as well. But I don't believe that it's a reference primarily to the frozen Russian central bank assets. I think the idea is that some Russian assets have been frozen, many in Ukraine, some outside Ukraine, that can be sold off and processed. You know, these include homes, real properties, some of these luxury ships. I believe Canada was considering selling off a seized airplane. Several countries, Canada included, have passed laws that allow the forfeiture of some of these Russian assets to Ukraine for these purposes. And so in this article, Shmyhal is discussing how the initial plan is to direct some of these seized assets for use in reconstruction of Crimea. It's been a little while since I've discussed it. Those of you who have been in Spaces for a long time might remember I used to primarily talk about economics, and there would occasionally be updates from the World Bank and others in making assessments about the estimated cost of reconstruction in Ukraine. And that number had crept up, north of $500 billion. Last I heard, I think it was over $600 billion. I haven't heard an estimate in several months. And the number has undoubtedly been increasing. And so there was talk initially about using the frozen Russian central bank assets held in Europe and North America that amount to about $300 billion for reconstruction efforts, but it's now clear that that won't even cover half. And so this is sort of the idea that all possible avenues will need to be pursued for recovery of assets in order to pursue reconstruction. Okay, there's another set of material that starts with a couple of more frozen asset issues. If you just bear with me, I'm putting them up in the nest. And I'm on probably to finish out the time over the next half an hour. But if anybody wants to chime in with comments or questions, if you have your own sources, I'm happy to have a look at them or answer questions as best I can. One more for the nest. Okay. All right. The first item up is actually fairly recent. So this is the tweet from Kenneth Roth, who was formerly with the he was the director of Human Rights Watch, but in any event, he's passing along an article from Foreign Policy that's noting a new law that's been passed in Russia that will allow the Russian government to seize the assets of foreign companies without compensation. And so there have been examples we've discussed over many months now of Russia seizing like car factories, for example, where some companies had just walked away and said, we're not doing business in Russia, we're leaving, and they just shut their plants down. And Russia, doesn't own those assets, but they've seized them in order to start the factories back up again. And a variety of other assets. So while those have been one-off cases, now Russia has passed this new law, which will allow the seizure of foreign assets more broadly, with a sort of a standard process. What reading this brought to my mind was an article from a little over a week ago talking about how some Western businesses attempted to exit quickly. And in order to exit quickly, often they had to take, pennies on the dollar, huge cuts on the value of their assets. Other businesses tried to get a better return on the sale of their business, arguing that essentially to sell out cheaply or to simply abandon it would be essentially turning the assets over to Russia, which, you know, not only for the sake of their shareholders, but like that's like abandoning and gifting it to Russia. Whereas if you can take a payout for it, you're drawing assets out of the country, which is, you know, not a horrible argument. But this article came out a little over a week ago talking about how it seems like there may have been a curve where the first to leave the country got very little. People in the middle term managed to find buyers and get sort of more. But as time has gone on, more time to try to find buyers is not resulting on better payouts for Western companies as they're trying to exit. And that now with this new law, where Russia can simply seize the assets, it seems like that window on departure is closing, and that really it was wiser to work to get out fairly quickly. So this is interesting. Of course, it will be applied based on the preferences of the Russian state. So many of those companies like OSINT and others, there are several French-based outlets and so on, who continue to operate enthusiastically. I don't imagine Russia is going to want to frustrate them by seizing their assets, but some of the others who have been dragging their feet trying to find better prices to sell their assets are at high risk of just having them seized. Go ahead, Exit.
Totally uneducated question, I suppose. Would large multinationals, I'm thinking more the grain area, just from my perspective, but like Viterra and some of the others, would they be better off to break off their Russian assets into a subsidiary that was separate as opposed to trying to sell them specifically?
Well, I don't imagine, in that if the ownership of the equity is still foreign, I don't know it would make much difference to Russia. I suspect what makes more difference is like political positioning, in that some countries are essentially saying, it makes no sense for us to leave. It's a valuable market. We think Russia deserves commercial service as well. Like, those are the sorts of companies that Russia is not going to want to deter because it has political cover for them. With Viterra, there are some industries where there was talk early on about how Russia appreciated that there was a long term. So through the summer of 2022, you guys would hear me discuss Russia paying out its bonds and the risk of default and how all of that was working out, and how Russia appeared to want to play ball by paying its bondholders in the West through a lot of that period, ultimately only prevented from continuing to pay on its bonds because of Western sanctions on their Western banks that prevented the banks from transferring the Russian payments. And that suggests that Russia is aware that by harming relationships now, it will hurt the willingness of these countries of these companies to return down the road. So I suspect that in some industries like grain, where there are just a handful of huge players, or perhaps, petrochemicals and the like, they probably won't exercise these powers, but they'll use them more so against, politically sensitive targets, car manufacturers, and those who they may get the sense they have already burned their bridges with. But I mean, part of that is speculation on my part about their, political motivations. Okay, continuing through the updates, the second item in the nest, this is more for interest and to say that if anybody listening is really into econ, I suspect there are people floating around who have a way better macro grounding than I do. The tweet is from Steve Hankey, and he is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, professor of applied economics. And I've seen him tweet about this several times, where he is saying his belief is that the current inflation rate in Russia is 60% per year. And obviously that's a hugely high inflation rate. you can see in the table in the tweet where that falls in the world. It's not the highest, but it's, in what is it, in the top 10? Puts Russia at number 10. I'm just not seeing others. So obviously he's a professor of applied economics. I presume he is applying the tools pretty well. There may be some range for interpretation on them. I'm just not hearing other people talk about the Russian inflation rate being 60%. And we heard recently that Russia increased its interest rate by several percentage points, but I believe the current interest rate is what, 12.5%, I think. So if the interest rate's 12.5%, but the actual inflation rate is 60%, that is slowly wearing away, right, at the foundations of the Russian economy. It's and if for political reasons they're unwilling to raise the interest rate in a way to bring inflation down, it will continue to eat away. So if anybody has more sources that either support Professor Hankey or estimate it somewhat lower, I'd be interested in looking at those. The third item is fairly recent data. It's a little over a week old, speaking to the number of people who left Russia between the start of the war and where they went, with the estimate being between 817,000 and 922,000 people, which is an update for me. I had last heard it was a little over 500,000 following the exodus of people in connection with the call up for mobilization in winter 2022. So now that the number is nearing 1 million people, it sounds like there's ongoing departures from Russia, which again wear away at their labor base. There are speculations that if Russia pursues an additional mobilization, I would expect this number to skyrocket. There were fears in previous call-ups that the Russians may take action to close the borders, which never happened. But, if those fears persist, I wouldn't be surprised to see hundreds of thousands more leave in the event of a further mobilization. The fourth item is a tweet from Medusa that looks into, we've talked about the impact of the Russian ruble exchange rate on Russia and what effect that has on its, talking about its current account balance and how the ruble rate is tied to the oil rate and to its trade balances. This was an interesting article from Medusa that talks about the impact of the swings in the ruble's value on the economies of Russia's neighbors. And so there are lots of Central Asian republics and the like for whom Russia is the largest trading partner. And so this can cause some havoc in their markets that affect their politics and the like. And so it also affects everything from, if the Russian ruble weakens, there is less incentive for laborers in these neighboring countries to go to Russia as migrant workers because they can't be paid as much proportionately as before, which has effects on migration flows. So, if you're deeply into economics, check out that article from Medusa. The fifth item. Nope, there were only 4 in that block. So let me grab the next set of tweets. I'll put them up and be back to speak to them in just a moment. Oh, actually, there was one I missed. Apparently, I didn't put it up in the nest. Let me put that up because that one's interesting. I knew there was one I should be covering. So that first item in the nest at the moment is an article from Bloomberg that spells out some speculation that came up about how the Russians may be attempting to work out an asset trade to try to sort of indirectly unlock some of their frozen assets. And so it's not, they cover a few things in this article. This is just one of them, but it's in there. And the suggestion is that they may approach foreigners, Westerners in Russia, who have assets there that have been frozen by the Russians out of the efforts to control the exchange rate. That, you know, they were locked up in March or April of 2022, and to say to the owners of those assets, we can't get the assets that are frozen here to you, but if you are willing to pay us an amount, essentially to unlock them, then we will say that ownership of some of our assets that have been frozen by the Western countries and are held in the West are transferred to your ownership. And, you know, therefore you're more likely to get them. Like, you'll get a higher proportion of payout than you will if you try and get us to free them for you. I have no idea how that makes sense. I'll be honest. I mean, it's floating around, but I am not optimistic at all that Western countries will hear about this plan and say, oh yeah, that's okay. You just bought these assets from the Russians, and we'll just unfreeze them for you, and here you go. So I don't know if the argument is that the owners of these assets can wait, you know, months or years in order to get, instead of getting 10% out, maybe they'll get 60% out, but they have to wait for Western countries to be willing to unfreeze these assets. I don't understand the motivation here, but anyway, it made some waves a little over a week ago, and we'll just have to see how it turns out. If anybody has seen more detail on how this plan is proposed to work, please do send it to me. I'd be interested. Exit, go ahead.
Are you allowed to sell assets that are currently being held? Like, how does that even work?
Well, I mean, frankly, under the sanctions, you can't, in most of these countries, you can't exchange assets that belong to the Russian state at all. So I presume that even entering into this deal with the Russians, whether, like, even if the Western countries aren't giving you the assets, like they're not foolish enough to turn them over, even entering into the contract with the Russians would violate sanctions, presumably, and therefore be illegal. So it's not clear to me, like, unless there's some very weird niche of asset class that isn't sanctioned, that the Russians are trying to make it work through. I don't understand how that would be made to work. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I read a couple different tweets today. One was actually from a Cuban, and he was saying how Russia is trying to incentivize migrants to come into work, you know, with promises of really high salaries and all kinds of things. But he was basically saying, don't go, you know, you're going to get mobilized. And then I'd also seen one, I wish I could remember the fellow's name, but he went through quite a good thread about the exchange rate, the economy. And yeah, even though the ruble is up a little bit, you know, that a lot had to do with actions of the central bank and so forth. But, you know, it's not a sustainable thing, and it's going to end up going back down. Even though oil is supposed to go up this year, you know, they're still limited in their market. But I got it. Well, I think I saw another one too, where they're really trying to actively entice migrant labor because there's labor shortage. And I think, you know, those who didn't get out before, who have the means, are getting out now because there is an announced mobilization for, you know, second conscription this year on the 24th of September. So I think that's why you're seeing more exodus.
When you say the 24th of September, are you referring to the normal biannual conscription process? Or, because I haven't heard anything about like an additional one-off mobilization. Is that just the normal winter conscription process you're referring to?
Yeah, that's just the normal conscription process. But I think, you know, they've looked around and see, all right, you know, what, well, and of course, the vast majority of them, they kind of listed the ages, you know, of the people who were leaving, and those are the ones, that are, particularly men, fighting age, and but yeah, that's normal conscription process. But what's normal in Russia? It isn't always normal.
Yeah, we'll have to keep our eye on how that works. I know that with the winter 2022 and then spring 2023 cycle, it was carefully watched how many they were going to call up and what the fill rates seem to be like. I know that Dara Masakot of RAND and others would follow those closely. It seems like the Russians have been very protective, wanting to maintain the ability to fill those conscription classes. So they've been fairly careful not to send conscripts through those systems to fight in Ukraine. Because if there's a fear that if you get conscripted in that way, you will go to Ukraine, then people will attempt to dodge it. And that's an important ongoing process for them to fill. So including among the things we'll need to keep an eye on are how many they call for and whether they make any changes on how those conscripts can be deployed. Exit, did you want to go ahead?
Just to mention that there's lots of Westerners that still end up traveling through Russia for their work. There's certainly people in the agricultural industry who still do that. They're mostly not laborers. They'd be more like contractors. But I know agriculture, and I suspect probably oil and gas, that is a thing. And I would be interested to see if they continue down that path, if it starts to hinder the number of Westerners that are willing to go in to do that work. And they may not have the specialties in country to actually proceed with some of those industries. So you might start seeing some other knock-on effects of those decisions. Although I would point out that we've said that for a year now, and we haven't necessarily seen those knock-on effects yet. But it's more of a long-term consideration to take. I think Mr. Bond's mute button must be stuck. Or is that just me?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, apologies. My mic mute button got stuck again for a few seconds there. Okay, just for expectations and timing, we're coming toward the end of the normal 3 hours. I had 2 last blocks of info on econ with the prospect of being able to actually work through it all. I think I'm going to do those 2 blocks, which will maybe be another 10 or 15 minutes. But I'll encourage you again to click through. If you scroll all the way to the right, you can always find the full agenda. So if you click through that tweet, there's a thread, all kinds of interesting things happening in diplomacy, humanitarian matters, cyber espionage. We're not going to have time to get to, but I put them up every week, so I hope somebody reads them. Okay. In these last blocks on economics, the first item is a link to a podcast that's put together by Bloomberg called The Big Take, where they're talking about the increasing efforts for the United States to build up production capacity to manufacture uranium fuel for nuclear power plants. And anyway, the theme of this block now is efforts to look at additional areas to sanction or big Russian industries that can be kind of cut out by the West, which have similar effects, right? If you sanction them, then they're gone. If you just replace them, then you don't need them anymore, which focuses on, uranium, diamonds. There have been a few industries which in the subsequent rounds of sanctions that have happened, there has been talk about sanctioning them, but ultimately they've been excluded for various reasons. So I'm highlighting a few of those. On this first tweet, one of those is uranium. which, since Russia is one of the primary suppliers, largely because of programs that were developed following the fall of the Soviet Union, in order to redirect Russian uranium from weapon systems into fuel to offer them an incentive, the Russians captured much of the uranium supply market. And so there are now significant efforts on by Westinghouse and other U.S.-based entities and one or two in Europe as well, to begin manufacturing this fuel in order to completely cut the Russians out and cut off one more of their avenues, not only to protect continued supply of the fuel in case Russia decided to withdraw it, but also to cut one more revenue stream of the Russians down the road. So have a listen to that podcast if you want to hear the discussion about it. The second back has two elements, the first of which is that the diamond industry is one of those I mentioned where sanctions have not been applied, even though debated. So it's not clear, because Russia is one of the primary diamond suppliers in the world. It's not clear if it will be included in any upcoming sanctions packages. But related to that, I guess a secondary issue in this case from the tweet by Nurlan Aliyev is that in this case, two Indian businesses that trade in diamonds and have activities in the United States have been found to be offside some sanctions, like they've been trading diamonds with sanctioned Russian entities. And as a result of breaching those sanctions, some of their assets in the United States have been frozen to the tune of $26 million, which is not a huge amount, but it's interesting. These are not secondary sanctions, right? This is not the United States saying, hey, we will apply economic penalties to you, India, for activities that you undertake in India with Russia. This is that the United States saying, hey, you have business here in the United States, and you're also breaking our sanctions laws by engaging with Russians, so we're freezing the assets that you have here. And now, interestingly, India has intervened to appeal to have those assets released, which will be an interesting test of diplomacy because, India is a party that is attempting to be neutral in the Ukraine war for the most part. And, as in saying we will do business with both sides. They're an important partner in, for example, the Quad in the Pacific, potentially, trying to counterbalance China in Asia. And so whether the United States yields to this and sort of goes against their principles on the Russian sanctions, or sticks to their guns and potentially starts to alienate India on this front, may be an indicator both of how the relationship goes forward, also whether before the United States would ever begin to apply secondary sanctions outside its own borders, it would first have to reject this. So how they act on this, will be interesting. If they yield on this, then it's very unlikely they will ever, pursue secondary sanctions in connection with the war in Ukraine. So we'll see. We'll have to see how it goes. Skate Park, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Just one thing about the Russian nuclear energy supply, like uranium production. Rosatom, which is the Russian state company which deals in this, also because of what you told about their role in supplying uranium and the technical support to nuclear power plants in many countries, they have enjoyed a carve-out in the sanctions. But Rosatom also runs mining operations that are unrelated to nuclear. And the State Department this summer started actually sanctioning some of the subsidiaries of Rosatom. So I think that is a development that we'll see further on, that some of the projects and subsidiaries of this company will stop enjoying this carve-out. And as you also said that several of the countries will look for alternative suppliers of uranium fuel, but that this has also a lot of technical details that maybe we can talk about in another space.
Yeah, that's a great point. The activities of Rosatom outside of Russia may become even more prominent if they're one of the vehicles by which Russia seeks to take over some of the activities of Wagner. Because people's eyes are on how those operations, how the Kremlin will try and take control of them. So it would be fairly bold of them to use one of their state entities that is already narrowly under scrutiny for application of sanctions. So we'll see if they're foolish enough to do that, to really bring the heat on them. Two more sort of grab bag economic update items, then I'll do one more block. The third item, back in the nest, it was announced 2 days ago. Ukraine has a list that they maintain of international war sponsors for those companies that have refused to cease their operations in Russia. This can be controversial. Some companies are providing, pharmaceuticals. Some of them are providing food, basics, and they're saying we can't leave, we can't cease those operations from our view for humanitarian reasons. I don't think this is applicable to these two companies, but Ukraine has now designated PepsiCo and Mars as international war sponsors. And every few weeks, they'll add to this list. I think most recently they added one of the alcohol companies, one of the big alcohol conglomerates, and they use it as a sort of a steady drumbeat of attention to companies that are still operating in Russia. And if you haven't taken the time to look at who those companies are and maybe have them govern your own consumption patterns, I'd encourage you to have a look. The fourth item, it's good news. It's just kind of random economic news. It was announced about a week ago that South Korea has decided to increase its economic aid to Ukraine to the tune of $400 million, which I think is something like 5 times the amount they had previously committed. Again, South Korea is not, for the most part, permitting the export of weaponry to Ukraine. And so this is all coming in the form of financial aid. We had a discussion about a week ago where we were talking about how much of the Ukrainian need for financial support was being met. And so this is, it's not inconsequential to suddenly say, here's another $350 million. So that's good news. Okay, just before I get into this last block of econ updates, I'm glad I finally got to talk about economics a little bit. I will point out 2 things. The first of which is that our next discussion will be on next Thursday, September 7th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, I hold these conversations twice a week. Thursdays at 9 p.m. and Saturdays at 4 p.m. Eastern. So it's now popped up as the first item in the nest. You can set your reminder now to come and join us. And then the one other reminder before this last block is I mentioned it at the top of the space, but if you're new here, we do live stream these talks to YouTube. The second item in the nest is a link to the YouTube account. Participate here so you can come up and speak with us. But if you miss a conversation, you want to hear it back, or you're listening in your car or doing chores, do check out the YouTube account. You can listen to us there. Okay, in this last block, starting with the third item in the nest, this is an article from Agence France Presse, as republished in the link to Barron's here. But it's an update on Gazprom's net income, which fell more than 80% versus last year. I believe that the amount of their income last year was 41.5 billion euro. And this year, their income is only 2.85 billion euro. So, that's more than 90%. Part of that is due to the fall in the price of the ruble, but largely it's because their ability to export natural gas to Europe has been almost completely cut based on EU sanctions. And they just haven't been able to redirect the natural gas to any other buyers because it was primarily transported via pipeline. There is still some natural gas flowing through pipelines, including, ironically, through Ukrainian territory, to some countries in Europe that under the EU sanctions got some exemptions to continue purchases. So it's not zero. Also, I believe they still have the capacity to export some liquefied natural gas, although that hasn't been their primary business. So it's still a fairly small relative to their prior revenue. But I'll go to Hans in a moment. But since it's connected, the fourth item in the nest is the article from the Kiev Independent that notes that, so even though Gazprom's profits are down 90%, interestingly, the EU member states bought the largest amount of liquefied natural gas they ever have, purchasing $5.8 billion worth of gas just in the first 7 months of 2023. And so, this is a potential step for further sanctions. If you can cut 90% of Gazprom's revenue, why not cut 100% of it? So they're actually taking a loss on an annual basis. And that's, if it's almost $6 billion in revenue on 7 months, ultimately that's probably going to be $8 billion in revenue over the year. And so, there may be scope here to expand sanctions to liquefied natural gas. Go ahead, Exit.
Two things, and they are both callbacks, so my apologies. The winter jackets thing, I thought that announcement talked about them working on winter women's clothing for the armed forces, and I was wrong. I found the tweet, and it did not mention that, so my apologies for that. But the Mars brand is kind of an interesting story, and I had to go back and look it up to make sure I was remembering that correctly. Mars owns a whole bunch of veterinary and diagnostic brands. So I don't know exactly how much they export worldwide, but that could have an effect on where some of their veterinary brands, or like how those are dealt with across other countries outside of Russia and outside of Ukraine. And it would be interesting to see if there's any effect from that particular naming on the veterinary industry in general. Specifically, they own 3 really large veterinary hospital conglomerates in North America. So if you go to Banfield or BCA or Blue Pearl as one of your pet hospitals, those are all owned by Mars, like the Mars brand. And so that's another idea to take into account when you're shopping with your money.
That, and presumably it's those sorts of businesses that they were operating in Russia, where they may feel that there's a humanitarian basis not to withdraw. And I sort of referred to that idea of controversy over Ukraine taking the position that they were war sponsors, where they argue that, they're manufacturing goods that if they withdrew, would cause unacceptable hardship. Now, you can come down on either side. I'm just highlighting that the controversy exists there. It's not necessarily the sale of chocolate bars, but I do know that occasionally you'll see posts of people noting that some of these companies that have those business lines they argue are necessary will also continue to sell discretionary items as well. And so they're not entirely protected by their argument for necessity. Two quick items before we wrap that are related to transit. So we're now on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the 6th and 7th items in the nest. Just tracking the anecdotal reports about problems affecting the Russian airline industries. So the 6th item is the tweet from Medusa talking about how the Russian airline Aeroflot has started to send some of its airplanes to Iran for maintenance. We've talked about how this is something they'd been pursuing, partly because Iran had been under sanctions for many years on these fronts, and so they had developed a little bit more of a domestic air maintenance industry, even if it wasn't particularly sophisticated in terms of access to Western replacement parts. But at least they had some personnel who had been working at this for some years. But interestingly, now there are reports that the Russian planes being sent to Iran had expected to come back in, X number of months, 3-4 months, and how that keeps getting pushed further and further. In this one case, a plane was expected to return April 2023. Now it's being announced that it's not going to be finished maintenance until March 2024. You're talking about almost a full year of delay just on maintenance. So that doesn't seem like it's, if that's on small volumes of aircraft for maintenance at this point, what happens when more of the Russian air fleets require maintenance? It doesn't seem like they're going to have the capacity to direct that to Iran for assistance. The 8th item, I think it's the 8th item, close enough, tweet by Yaroslav Trofimov, who made the observation, because of Ukrainian drone attacks in the Moscow region, we have seen almost every day for the last 2 weeks or so that airports in the Moscow region have been shut down. Now, those shutdowns vary, between 15 minutes, half an hour, to sometimes they're shut for several days at a stretch with no operation. And this point I thought was a good one, which is some of these international airlines that are flying into the, because presumably the Moscow region is the busiest destination for foreign flights. If these airports are being closed, how is that affecting the profitability for the airlines that are flying into them? If your passengers are having to be redirected, if you're having to refuel at airports that aren't, they may not have the same pricing on fuel, your airplanes may be holding for much longer, burning more fuel. So I presume that it may be making some of these flights unprofitable. And either airline ticket prices are going to take a huge rise, or perhaps service rates will fall. And so I'm just, again, these are anecdotal points about the continuing apparent weakening of the Russian airline industries. Which leads into last point, which is actually the 8th item back. It's a tweet by Daniel Fried, former ambassador, linking to an AP News article, which characterizes the idea that Russian sanctions are working like a slow poison. And so I know people are impatient. They'll say, oh, the export controls are being circumvented. They're still getting electronics. Their econ, isn't horrible. But when you look at the combination of fall in the value of the ruble, claims that the Russian inflation rate is, quite high, that one source claiming 60%, you're looking at departures of the labor force en masse, approaching 1 million people. You're looking at declines in the airline industry, Russia now seeking to seize the property of foreign businesses, sort of at will. It really does seem like it's a slow poison that where the harms are accumulating and people are impatient with it. But I do think that it will ultimately play a significant role in incentivizing the Russians to end the war. So with that, I guess I'll call it. I'll make one last call for the fact that there is a bunch of material we didn't have an opportunity to cover. If you were to look at the first item in the nest, that links to, just because of the number of tweets you can post at once, I post the agenda in 2 parts. Most of the second part of the agenda we didn't get to, material on developments in diplomacy, cyber, and some items on Russian forces, some of which, there's interesting stuff in there, including the upcoming Russian elections, the ongoing voting of which is taking place in occupied Ukrainian territory right now. There are lots of interesting developments. So I'd encourage you to take a moment to look at some of those stories. If I'm not mistaken, I think we have a guest coming for our next talk on Thursday who deals with naval matters, particularly in the Baltic Sea and sort of the Russian impact in the North Seas there. So if you're interested in naval matters, drop by to listen to that chat. I think with that, I'll wrap it up. I'll say thank you to everybody who came to listen. I'd like to thank all the people who came up to speak today. A couple of our regular friends were here. I'd encourage anybody who came up to speak, Andrew Perpetua, Colby Badwar. I'm sure I'm missing out on a few others. Have a look at their profiles. They've been following the events in the war in detail through, the whole almost 2 years now. So look at their profiles. I'd encourage you to follow them. And I'd like to thank my co-hosts. Exit has co-hosted through the whole thing. Jacoby helped me out a fair bit. I think had to drop for technical reasons. And before I wrap, I'll go to Exit for a last comment.
I just was going to say, it's Mike Peterson who's coming this Thursday. I will put a tweet together right after this, but he's a professor at the Naval War College and the director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute. And he had just written a piece in a book that I read, and it's really good. And I hope you'll all come bring some questions for him.
And Exit, throwing in a last comment, reminded me that I think she is probably co-hosting for our friend Sam Bendett, who is holding his monthly space on drone tech in the war. And that's going to be on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. So go to Sam's profile and you could probably find the invitation for that space, just because that will come up before our next talk. Yeah, go ahead, Exit.
This month, we actually had to change it. It's tomorrow night, Monday night, at 5 p.m. Sam's traveling this week, so we had to change things around a bit this month.
I missed that, so I'm glad you mentioned it. So if you're able to join Sam tomorrow night, then please do. And so, once again, thanks to all the speakers, thanks to my co-hosts, and hopefully we will see you guys all on Thursday night. Until then, have a great night.